There are places in this world where history feels more like a puzzle than a record, and few are as shrouded in secrecy as the Vatican. Hidden chambers beneath centuries-old architecture, ancient manuscripts locked away from public eyes, symbols carved into sacred art that seem to hint at knowledge long forgotten. These aren't rumors or wild speculation. They are documented enigmas that historians, theologians, and researchers still struggle to fully explain. Before we dive into it, here's a quick note. The visuals in this video aren't necessary to enjoy the stories. They make it more dynamic, but you can follow along entirely through the audio. Feel free to let this play in the background while you work, relax, or even fall asleep to these mysteries beyond explanation. And if you'd like to support me in making these videos, consider subscribing to the channel. Let's begin our journey into the most hidden corners of the ancient Vatican. Deep within the Vatican's most guarded chambers, behind walls that have witnessed centuries of secrets, lies an artifact that has shaped the course of empires and inspired legends that stretch back over 2,000 years. The Holy Lance, also known as the Spear of Destiny, is more than just a piece of ancient metal. It is said to be the very weapon that pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion, and according to legend, whoever possesses it holds the power to conquer the world. But is this claim rooted in historical fact, or is it simply one of the most enduring myths ever created? The story of the Holy Lance is a tapestry woven from threads of faith, politics, warfare, and mystery. It's a tale that has captivated emperors, driven crusaders across continents, and continues to puzzle historians today. The lance itself appears deceptively simple at first glance. Measuring roughly 11 inches in length, it consists of an iron spearhead bound together with silver wire and encased in a golden sleeve. Yet this unassuming relic has been the subject of more controversy, more bloodshed, and more fervent belief than perhaps any other artifact in Christian history. The legend begins at Calvary, on that fateful day when Jesus Christ hung dying on the cross. According to the Gospel of John, a Roman soldier, later identified as Longinus, approached the crucified Christ. To ensure that Jesus was truly dead, Longinus thrust his spear into Christ's side. From the wound flowed blood and water, fulfilling the prophecies and marking the moment when an ordinary Roman weapon became something extraordinary. But what happened to this spear after that moment? This is where history begins to blur with legend, where documented fact gives way to centuries of storytelling, political manipulation, and religious fervor. The early accounts are fragmentary, scattered across different sources and often contradictory. Some say Longinus himself, overcome by what he had witnessed, became a convert to Christianity and preserved the lance as a sacred relic. Others suggest it disappeared into the chaos of post-crucifixion Jerusalem, only to resurface centuries later. The first concrete historical mention of a lance claimed to be the Spear of Destiny appears in the 4th century. By this time, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine the Great. Suddenly, there was tremendous value in possessing Christian relics, and the Holy Lance emerged as one of the most coveted of all. But even then, multiple lances were already being claimed as the authentic relic, setting up a mystery that persists to this day. One of the most significant early appearances of a Holy Lance was in Constantinople, the great Christian capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine emperors claimed to possess the true spear, and they used it as a symbol of divine authority, carrying it into battle and displaying it during important ceremonies. For them, the lance wasn't just a religious artifact. It was a political tool that legitimized their rule and demonstrated God's favor. But the story becomes even more complex when we move to Western Europe. In the early 9th century, another Holy Lance appeared in the possession of the Holy Roman Empire. This lance would become perhaps the most famous and influential of all the claimed spears. It was first documented in the hands of King Henry the Fowler of Germany, who credited his victories to the power of the sacred relic. The legend of this particular lance grew tremendously under Henry's successor, Otto the Great. Otto carried the spear into the decisive Battle of Lechfeld in 955, where his forces defeated the invading Magyar army. This victory was seen as so miraculous, so divinely inspired, that it cemented the lance's reputation as a weapon of divine power. From that moment forward, possession of the Holy Lance became synonymous with the right to rule the Holy Roman Empire. For the next 1,000 years, this lance would pass from emperor to emperor, becoming one of the most important symbols of imperial power in medieval Europe. Each ruler who possessed it claimed divine sanction for their reign. The lance was present at coronations, carried into battles, and displayed during the most solemn religious ceremonies. It became not just a relic, but a cornerstone of political legitimacy. Perhaps no ruler was more associated with the Holy Lance than Frederick Barbarossa, the legendary Holy Roman Emperor of the 12th century. Frederick was said to sleep with the lance beside him and to consult it before making important decisions. According to the chronicles of his time, as long as Barbarossa possessed the lance, he was invincible in battle and wise in governance. But when the lance was briefly lost during one of his Italian campaigns, Frederick suffered a series of defeats that nearly cost him his empire. The pattern continued through the centuries. Rulers rose and fell, but the Holy Lance remained a constant symbol of divine authority. When Napoleon conquered much of Europe in the early 19th century, one of his first acts was to seize the Holy Lance and other imperial regalia. He understood intuitively what medieval emperors had known for centuries, that possession of these sacred objects was as important as military victories in establishing legitimacy. But it was in the 20th century that the Holy Lance would play perhaps its most controversial role. As Nazi Germany rose to power, Adolf Hitler became obsessed with occult artifacts and symbols of power. According to numerous accounts, Hitler was particularly fixated on the Holy Lance, believing that it would grant him the supernatural power needed to establish his 1,000-year Reich. The story goes that Hitler first encountered the lance as a young man visiting the Hofburg Museum in Vienna, where it was displayed as part of the Habsburg treasure collection. Witnesses claimed that Hitler would stand before the lance for hours, transfixed by its presence. Some accounts suggest that this encounter shaped his later obsessions with occult power and divine destiny. When Nazi Germany annexed Austria in 1938, one of Hitler's first acts was to transport the Holy Lance and other Habsburg treasures to Nuremberg, the spiritual center of the Nazi movement. The lance was displayed in the Church of St. Catherine, where it became part of the Nazi mythology surrounding ancient German power and destiny. According to legend, Hitler's obsession with the lance was so complete that he believed his fate was tied to its possession. Some accounts claim that he lost the war precisely when the lance fell out of his hands, captured by American forces in April of 1945. General George Patton himself was said to have taken possession of the relic, understanding its symbolic importance. But here's where the story becomes even more intriguing. After the war, the Holy Lance was returned to Vienna, where it remains on display today in the Hofburg Museum. Yet questions persist about whether the lance that Hitler possessed, and that now sits in Vienna, is actually the same artifact that medieval emperors carried into battle. Some researchers suggest that the real lance disappeared centuries ago, replaced by copies and forgeries that have taken on lives of their own. Scientific analysis of the Vienna lance has raised more questions than it has answered. Metallurgical studies have shown that the spearhead is indeed ancient, possibly dating to the 1st century CE. This gives credence to claims that it could be from the Roman period. However, the analysis also revealed that the artifact has been repeatedly modified over the centuries. The silver wire binding the pieces together was added much later, as was the gold sleeve that encases part of the spear. More puzzling still, embedded within the spearhead is what appears to be a nail. According to tradition, this is one of the nails from Christ's crucifixion, added to the lance to increase its sacred power. But when this nail was analyzed, it was found to be made of a different type of metal than the spearhead, suggesting it was inserted at a later date. These scientific findings highlight one of the central mysteries of the Holy Lance. Even if we accept that the Vienna artifact is ancient enough to be from the Roman period, how can we prove that it was actually used in the crucifixion? The historical record from the 1st century is notoriously sparse, and the earliest Christian sources make no mention of preserving the soldier's spear as a relic. Furthermore, the Vienna lance is not the only artifact claiming to be the true Holy Lance. The Vatican itself possesses what it claims is a piece of the authentic spear, known as the Lance of St. Peter's. This fragment is said to have been discovered in Antioch during the First Crusade in 1098. According to the chroniclers of the Crusade, the lance was revealed to a French priest in a vision, and its discovery inspired the Crusaders to achieve a miraculous victory against overwhelming odds. Yet another lance, kept in the Jeghard Monastery in Armenia, is claimed by the Armenian Apostolic Church to be the true spear of destiny. This lance has its own detailed provenance, tracing its history back to the apostle who first brought Christianity to Armenia. Each of these artifacts has passionate defenders who can point to historical documents, religious traditions, and even miraculous events to support their claims. So which, if any, is the real Holy Lance? This question has occupied historians, theologians, and archaeologists for centuries, and no definitive answer has emerged. The problem is that the standard methods of historical verification become almost impossible to apply to artifacts that are claimed to be 2,000 years old and have passed through so many hands. Consider the challenges involved. First, there are no contemporary records from the crucifixion that describe the spear in detail. The Gospel accounts mention the piercing, but provide no physical description of the weapon used. Second, the early centuries of Christianity were marked by persecution and chaos, making it unlikely that systematic records were kept of religious artifacts. Third, the tremendous religious and political value placed on Christian relics in later centuries created powerful incentives for forgery and false claims. But perhaps the question of authenticity misses the point entirely. The Holy Lance's true power may lie not in its historical authenticity, but in the belief it has inspired throughout history. Whether or not the Vienna lance actually pierced Christ's side, it has undeniably shaped the course of European history for over a millennium. The lance has been present at coronations of Holy Roman emperors, carried into battles that determined the fate of nations, and venerated by millions of believers. It has inspired art, literature, and music. It has driven explorers to search for other holy relics and motivated crusaders to march across continents. In a very real sense, the Holy Lance's legend has created its own reality. This phenomenon points to something profound about human nature and the role that sacred objects play in our societies. Throughout history, humans have attributed special powers to certain objects, whether they are the crown jewels of England, the Statue of Liberty, or the Holy Lance. These objects become repositories of meaning that transcend their physical properties. The Holy Lance also illustrates how religious belief and political power have intertwined throughout history. Medieval emperors didn't claim the lance simply because they believed it was holy. They claimed it because it legitimized their rule in the eyes of their subjects. The lance became proof that God favored their reign, making rebellion not just treason but sacrilege. This political dimension adds another layer to the mystery. How many of the historical figures who claimed to possess the lance actually believed in its supernatural power, and how many simply understood its value as a political symbol? The line between genuine faith and calculated manipulation is often impossible to draw. Consider Otto the Great's victory at the Battle of Lechfeld. Did Otto win because the Holy Lance granted him divine power, or did his superior tactics and well-trained army defeat the Magyar forces? When the victory was attributed to the lance, was this a sincere expression of religious belief or a shrewd political move to enhance Otto's legitimacy? Perhaps it was both simultaneously. The story of the Holy Lance also reflects changing attitudes toward the relationship between the divine and the material world. In medieval Christianity, sacred objects were believed to be imbued with actual supernatural power. Relics could heal the sick, protect armies in battle, and influence the course of natural events. This worldview made the Holy Lance not just symbolically important, but practically essential for effective rule. As the Enlightenment brought more scientific ways of thinking about the world, belief in the literal power of relics began to decline among educated elites. Yet the Holy Lance continued to fascinate people, suggesting that its appeal goes deeper than simple superstition. Even in our scientific age, there's something compelling about the idea that an object could carry such historical weight and symbolic power. The Nazi obsession with the lance represents a particularly dark chapter in this story. Hitler and his followers combined medieval mysticism with modern propaganda techniques, using ancient symbols to legitimize thoroughly modern forms of brutality. The Holy Lance became part of a pseudo-religious mythology that attempted to justify genocide and war. This raises uncomfortable questions about the role that sacred objects can play in human affairs. Can artifacts that have inspired so much genuine faith and noble action also become tools of evil? The Holy Lance's journey from Calvary to Nazi Germany suggests that the meaning of sacred objects is not fixed, but is constantly being reinterpreted by each generation. Today, the Holy Lance continues to attract visitors from around the world to the Hofburg Museum in Vienna. Some come as believers, hoping to experience something of the sacred in the presence of the relic. Others come as skeptics, curious about the role that superstition has played in shaping history. Many fall somewhere in between, drawn by the mystery and the story without necessarily accepting the supernatural claims. Modern scholars who study the lance tend to focus less on questions of authenticity and more on understanding its cultural significance. They examine how the legend evolved over time, how different cultures interpreted its meaning, and what its story tells us about the societies that venerated it. From this perspective, the Holy Lance becomes a lens through which we can examine broader themes in human history. The relationship between faith and power, the role of symbols in society, and the ways that objects can embody collective beliefs and aspirations. Recent archaeological and historical research has also shed new light on the world in which the Holy Lance legend originated. We now know much more about Roman military equipment in the 1st century, about the political and religious dynamics of early Christianity, and about how Christian relics were collected and venerated in the centuries following the crucifixion. This research suggests that while a Roman soldier almost certainly did pierce Christ's side with a spear, as described in the Gospels, the chances that any specific artifact today is that exact spear are vanishingly small. The chaos of the crucifixion, the persecution of early Christians, and the passage of 2 millennia make preservation of the actual weapon extremely unlikely. Yet this conclusion doesn't diminish the historical importance of the Holy Lance legend. Whether or not the Vienna artifact is authentic, it has served as a focal point for faith, a symbol of power, and a source of mystery for countless generations. Its story illuminates fundamental aspects of human nature and social organization that remain relevant today. The Holy Lance also raises questions about how we should approach historical artifacts more generally. In an age when scientific analysis can tell us precisely when and where an object was made, what materials it contains, and how it has been modified over time, how should we evaluate claims about supernatural properties or miraculous origins? Some argue that scientific analysis should be the final arbiter, that claims about artifacts should be accepted only if they can be verified through empirical evidence. Others contend that this approach misses something essential about human experience, that the meaning and power of objects like the Holy Lance transcend what can be measured in a laboratory. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Scientific analysis can tell us important things about the Holy Lance's physical properties and historical journey, but it cannot capture the full significance of what this object has meant to millions of people over the centuries. To understand the lance completely, we need both scientific rigor and an appreciation for the role that faith and symbolism play in human culture. The ongoing debate about the Holy Lance also reflects broader tensions in our society about the relationship between reason and faith, between empirical evidence and traditional belief. These tensions are not likely to be resolved anytime soon, and artifacts like the Holy Lance will continue to serve as focal points for these discussions. As we consider the Holy Lance today, we might ask what lessons its story offers for our modern world. In an age when information spreads instantly across the globe and scientific knowledge advances at an unprecedented pace, do sacred objects and ancient legends still have a role to play in human society? The continued fascination with the Holy Lance suggests that they do. Even in our secular age, people are drawn to objects and stories that connect them to something larger than themselves, that provide a sense of continuity with the past, and that embody ideals and aspirations that transcend everyday concerns. The Holy Lance reminds us that humans are not purely rational beings who make decisions based solely on empirical evidence. We are also creatures of emotion, imagination, and spiritual longing. We need symbols and stories that help us make sense of our place in the world and our connection to the divine, however we understand it. At the same time, the darker chapters in the Holy Lance's story warn us about the dangers of allowing symbols and legends to override our moral compass. The same object that inspired medieval emperors to see themselves as God's representatives on earth also became part of Nazi ideology that justified unspeakable atrocities. Perhaps the real lesson of the Holy Lance is that the power of sacred objects lies not in the objects themselves, but in what we choose to do with them. The lance has been used to justify both noble crusades and horrific wars, both acts of faith and acts of manipulation. Its story is ultimately our story, a reflection of humanity's capacity for both transcendence and corruption. Whether the Holy Lance possesses supernatural power remains a matter of faith rather than empirical proof, but there can be no doubt that it has possessed tremendous historical power, shaping the course of empires and the lives of countless individuals. In that sense, at least, the Spear of Destiny has lived up to its name, continuing to influence human affairs long after the events that supposedly gave it power. As it rests today in its climate-controlled case in Vienna, the Holy Lance continues to pose questions that each generation must answer for itself. What do we believe about the relationship between the material and spiritual worlds? How do we balance respect for tradition with commitment to truth? What role should ancient legends play in modern life? These are not easy questions, and the Holy Lance offers no simple answers. Instead, it stands as a testament to the complexity of human nature and the enduring power of objects to embody our deepest beliefs and aspirations. Whether divine artifact or medieval forgery, the Holy Lance remains one of history's most compelling mysteries, a puzzle that says as much about those who contemplate it as about the object itself. In the hushed silence of Turin Cathedral, behind bulletproof glass and sophisticated climate control systems, lies what might be the most scrutinized piece of cloth in human history: the Shroud of Turin, a 14-foot-long linen cloth bearing the faint but unmistakable image of a crucified man, has been subjected to more scientific analysis than perhaps any other archaeological artifact. Yet after decades of investigation, using the most advanced techniques available to modern science, the shroud remains as mysterious as ever. The image on the cloth is haunting in its detail. It shows the front and back views of a man who has suffered wounds consistent with Roman crucifixion, nail marks in the hands and feet, a wound in the side, marks from a crown of thorns, and evidence of severe scourging across the back and legs. The anatomical precision is remarkable, showing details of human physiology that weren't understood when the shroud first appeared in documented history during the 14th century. But here's what makes the Shroud of Turin truly extraordinary. The image appears to be a photographic negative. When the first photographs of the shroud were taken in 1898 by Italian photographer Secondo Pia, the negative revealed a positive image with startling clarity and three-dimensional properties. This was decades before anyone understood how such an effect could be created artificially, and it remains unexplained today. The controversy surrounding the shroud is not merely academic. For millions of Christians worldwide, this cloth represents tangible evidence of Christ's passion and resurrection. For skeptics, it represents one of history's most elaborate hoaxes. For scientists, it presents a puzzle that has resisted solution despite the application of the most sophisticated analytical techniques available. The shroud's documented history begins in the small French town of Liéry in the 1350s, when it was displayed by Geoffrey de Charny, a French knight. From the very beginning, the cloth was controversial. Local church authorities questioned its authenticity, and the Bishop of Troyes declared it to be a painting. Yet the de Charny family maintained its authenticity and continued to display it for public veneration. The early history of how the shroud came to be in the de Charny family's possession remains murky. Geoffrey de Charny never explained how he acquired it, leading to centuries of speculation. Some researchers have attempted to trace the shroud back through earlier Christian relics, suggesting it might be the same cloth mentioned in Byzantine sources as the image of Edessa or the Mandilion of Constantinople. These earlier references describe a miraculous image of Christ's face that was not made by human hands. According to legend, this image was created when Christ pressed a cloth to his face, leaving behind a perfect impression. Some theorists suggest that this cloth was actually the shroud, folded in such a way that only the face was visible, explaining why early accounts mention only facial features rather than a full-body image. The trail grows even more speculative when researchers attempt to trace the shroud back to 1st century Palestine. There are no unambiguous historical records linking any specific cloth to the crucifixion, despite the importance such an artifact would have held for early Christians. This gap in the historical record is one of the strongest arguments against the shroud's authenticity as Christ's burial cloth. However, supporters of the shroud's authenticity argue that the absence of early records doesn't prove the cloth is inauthentic. Early Christians faced severe persecution and would have had good reasons to keep such a precious relic hidden. Furthermore, the practice of preserving and venerating relics developed gradually in Christian culture and wasn't widespread in the very earliest centuries of the faith. The shroud's journey from France to Italy began in the late 15th century, when the de Charny family gave it to the House of Savoy, the ruling family of what would later become Italy. The Savoys treated the shroud as one of their most precious possessions, building elaborate chapels to house it and commissioning detailed artistic copies to preserve its image. Throughout its time in Savoy custody, the shroud survived several near disasters. In 1492, it was nearly destroyed in a fire that melted the silver reliquary containing it. Drops of molten silver burned holes in the cloth and left distinctive triangular marks that are still visible today. In 1997, another fire damaged the cathedral where it was housed, though the shroud itself was saved by firefighters who broke through the bulletproof glass to rescue it. The modern scientific investigation of the shroud began in earnest in the 1970s, when the Catholic Church finally allowed researchers direct access to the cloth. In 1978, a team of American scientists called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, was permitted to conduct extensive tests over a period of 5 days. The STURP team used a battery of scientific instruments to analyze every aspect of the shroud: X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, infrared thermography, ultraviolet photography, microscopy, and chemical analysis. Their findings were both fascinating and puzzling. They confirmed that the image was not painted on the cloth and found no evidence of artificial pigments or dyes in the image areas. Instead, the image appeared to be formed by a subtle alteration in the color of the linen fibers themselves. Under microscopic examination, the image-bearing fibers showed signs of oxidation and dehydration, as if they had been aged or chemically altered in some way. But this alteration occurred only on the topmost surface of the threads, penetrating no deeper than a few micrometers. This discovery was significant because it ruled out most conventional explanations for how the image could have been created. Paint would have penetrated deeper into the fibers and would have been detectable through chemical analysis. Similarly, most dyes and stains would have shown different patterns of penetration and would have left chemical residues that the STURP team didn't find. Even more intriguing was the discovery that the intensity of the image corresponded to the distance the cloth would have been from a three-dimensional object. Areas that would have been closer to a body, such as the nose and forehead, showed darker image formation, while areas that would have been further away showed lighter formation. This three-dimensional correlation was unprecedented in any known artwork from the medieval period. The STURP team also made careful studies of what appeared to be bloodstains on the shroud. These stains tested positive for the presence of iron, which is consistent with aged blood, and showed patterns consistent with blood flow from wounds. The blood stains appeared to have been on the cloth before the formation of the body image, as the image formation process seemed to have occurred around the blood rather than through it. However, the most famous and controversial scientific test of the shroud came in 1988, when the Catholic Church authorized radiocarbon dating of small samples from the cloth. 3 independent laboratories in Oxford, Arizona, and Zurich all reached the same conclusion. The shroud dated to between 1260 and 1390 CE, placing its creation squarely in the medieval period rather than the 1st century. This radiocarbon dating result should have settled the question of the shroud's authenticity, but instead it opened up new avenues of controversy. Supporters of the shroud's authenticity questioned whether the samples tested were representative of the original cloth. They pointed out that the samples were taken from a corner of the shroud that had been handled frequently over the centuries and might have been contaminated with newer materials. Some researchers suggested that medieval repairs to fire damage might have introduced newer cotton fibers into the area where the samples were taken. Others proposed that centuries of candle smoke, incense, and human handling could have deposited carbon-containing materials on the cloth, skewing the radiocarbon results toward a more recent date. The sampling procedure itself became a source of controversy. The original protocol called for samples to be taken from multiple areas of the shroud to ensure representative dating, but this was changed at the last minute to a single sampling from one corner. Critics argued that this change compromised the reliability of the results and that proper archaeological sampling procedures weren't followed. In the years since the 1988 radiocarbon dating, numerous researchers have challenged these results using various scientific arguments. Some have proposed that the shroud was exposed to neutron radiation during the resurrection, which could theoretically have altered the carbon isotope ratios in the cloth and made it appear younger than it actually is. Others have suggested that bacterial contamination could have affected the radiocarbon results. Microbiologist Leoncio Garza Valdez claimed to have found evidence of a bioplastic coating on shroud fibers, created by bacteria over centuries, that could have introduced newer carbon into the samples. However, these alternative explanations remain highly speculative and haven't been accepted by the broader scientific community. Meanwhile, other researchers have continued to study the image formation process itself, seeking to understand how the shroud's image could have been created. Various theories have been proposed, ranging from natural processes involving body chemistry to supernatural intervention to elaborate medieval forgery techniques. One natural explanation suggests that the image was formed through the interaction of ammonia vapors from a decomposing body with starch residues on the linen cloth. According to this theory, the ammonia would have created the observed oxidation patterns on the surface of the fibers. However, experiments attempting to replicate this process have not successfully reproduced the precise characteristics of the shroud image. Another natural theory proposes that the image was created through the Maillard reaction, a chemical process that occurs when amino acids and sugars are heated together. This reaction could potentially explain the superficial nature of the image formation and its three-dimensional properties. However, this theory requires the presence of specific chemicals on the cloth and precise temperature conditions that would be difficult to explain in a first-century burial context. On the supernatural end of the spectrum, some researchers have proposed that the image was created by an intense burst of energy during the resurrection itself. According to this theory, some form of radiation or energy discharge from Christ's body would have imprinted the image onto the shroud at the moment of resurrection. While this explanation is consistent with Christian belief about the resurrection, it's not scientifically testable and relies on assumptions about supernatural events. The forgery theories are perhaps the most numerous and varied. Some researchers have suggested that the shroud was created by a medieval artist using techniques that were sophisticated for their time, but are not well understood today. Various methods have been proposed: acid etching, use of heated metal sculptures, application of powdered pigments, and even early photographic techniques. One of the most detailed forgery theories was proposed by Michel, who suggested that the shroud was created using a technique called dust rubbing or frottage. According to this theory, a medieval artist created a bas-relief sculpture of a crucified man and then placed cloth over it and rubbed it with an acidic substance to create the image. Michel was able to create shroud-like images using this technique, though critics argue that his reproductions lack many of the subtle characteristics of the original. More recently, Italian scientist Luigi Garlascelli claimed to have created a shroud-like image using techniques that would have been available in medieval times. His method involved painting a volunteer with an acidic solution, wrapping the body in linen, and then aging the cloth in an oven. The result was an image with some similarities to the shroud, though again, critics pointed out significant differences in the details. Despite these various attempts at replication, no one has successfully reproduced all the characteristics of the shroud image using techniques that would have been available in the medieval period. The combination of the image's superficial nature, its three-dimensional properties, its photographic negative characteristics, and its resistance to various forms of analysis continues to puzzle researchers. The blood evidence on the shroud presents another layer of complexity to the authentication question. Forensic analysis of the apparent bloodstains has revealed patterns consistent with blood flow from wounds, including the effects of gravity and clotting. The blood appears to have been on the cloth before the image formation, and its chemical composition is consistent with aged human blood. However, some researchers have questioned whether the stains are actually blood, or whether they might be artistic representations created using other materials. The blood appears unusually red for material that would be 2,000 years old, though supporters argue that certain conditions could preserve blood color over long periods. DNA analysis of material from the shroud has yielded ambiguous results. Some researchers claim to have found human DNA, while others suggest that the samples are too degraded to provide reliable information. The possibility of contamination from centuries of handling makes definitive DNA analysis extremely challenging. The pollen evidence found on the shroud has also been controversial. Palynologist Max Frey claimed to have identified pollen from plants specific to Palestine and the Middle East, suggesting that the shroud had been in those regions at some point in its history. However, other researchers have questioned Frey's methodology and conclusions, and the pollen evidence remains disputed. Recent technological advances have opened new avenues for shroud research. High-resolution digital imaging has revealed previously unknown details about the image and the cloth itself. Three-dimensional analysis has confirmed the unusual spatial properties of the image that were first noted decades ago. Computer-enhanced imaging has also revealed what some researchers believe are additional details, including images of flowers, coins over the eyes, and various inscriptions. However, these findings remain highly controversial, with many researchers arguing that the alleged details are the result of image processing artifacts rather than real features on the cloth. The debate over the Shroud of Turin reflects broader questions about the relationship between science and faith, between empirical evidence and religious belief. For many Christians, the shroud represents a tangible connection to the Passion of Christ, regardless of scientific findings. For atheists and agnostics, it represents the persistence of superstitious thinking in an age of scientific reason. But the shroud also presents a unique case study in the application of scientific methods to historical and religious questions. The level of scientific scrutiny applied to this single artifact is unprecedented, involving dozens of different analytical techniques and hundreds of researchers over several decades. This scientific investigation has revealed just how complex the authentication of ancient artifacts can be. Even with the most sophisticated analytical tools available, definitive conclusions remain elusive. The shroud exists in a gray area where multiple interpretations of the evidence remain plausible, where expert researchers examining the same data can reach different conclusions. The continuing mystery of the Shroud of Turin also illustrates the limits of scientific knowledge. Despite all our technological advances, we still cannot fully explain how this image was formed or definitively determine its age and origin. The shroud reminds us that there are still questions that science cannot answer with certainty, still mysteries that resist our attempts to solve them. Perhaps more importantly, the shroud raises questions about what constitutes proof in matters that touch on religious faith. Even if scientific analysis could definitively prove that the shroud was Christ's burial cloth, would that constitute proof of the resurrection? Even if it could definitively prove that the shroud was a medieval creation, would that disprove Christian faith? These questions point to fundamental differences in how people approach truth and evidence. For some, scientific evidence is the ultimate arbiter of truth, and claims should be accepted only if they can be empirically verified. For others, there are truths that transcend empirical evidence, realities that cannot be captured in a laboratory but are nonetheless real and important. The Shroud of Turin has become a focal point for these different approaches to truth and knowledge. It has generated an enormous literature spanning scientific journals, religious publications, historical analyses, and popular books. Conferences dedicated to shroud research attract participants from around the world, representing diverse fields of study and widely varying perspectives on the artifact's significance. The economic and cultural impact of the shroud extends far beyond academic research. Turin has become a pilgrimage destination for millions of people who come to view the shroud during its rare public exhibitions. The cloth has inspired countless works of art, literature, and film. It has become a symbol recognized around the world, regardless of one's religious beliefs. The shroud has also raised important questions about the ownership and stewardship of religious artifacts. Currently owned by the Vatican but housed in Turin, the shroud represents a unique form of cultural property that transcends normal categories of ownership. It belongs in some sense to all of Christianity, to the scientific community studying it, and to humanity as a whole as a potential artifact of enormous historical significance. As we look to the future, new technologies may eventually provide more definitive answers about the shroud's origins and the formation of its image. Advanced chemical analysis, improved dating techniques, and new forms of imaging may reveal details that are currently hidden from us. Alternatively, the These new techniques may only deepen the mystery, revealing additional layers of complexity that we cannot yet understand. The story of the Shroud of Turin is far from over. Each generation of researchers brings new questions, new techniques, and new perspectives to the study of this remarkable artifact. Whether it ultimately proves to be a first-century burial cloth or a medieval masterpiece, the Shroud has already secured its place in history as one of the most intriguing and controversial objects ever discovered. In our age of rapid technological change and increasing scientific knowledge, the Shroud of Turin stands as a reminder that some mysteries resist easy solution. It challenges us to remain humble in the face of the unknown, to acknowledge the limits of our current understanding, and to remain open to possibilities that may challenge our assumptions about what is possible. The Shroud also reminds us that the search for truth is not always a simple matter of applying scientific methods and accepting the results. Truth can be complex, multifaceted, and resistant to simple categorization. The most important truths may be those that cannot be definitively proven or disproven, that require us to make judgments based on incomplete information and personal conviction. Whether the Shroud of Turin is authentic or impossible may ultimately be less important than what it teaches us about the nature of faith, the limits of knowledge, and the enduring human quest for connection with the divine. In that sense, the Shroud has already proven its authenticity as a profound human artifact, regardless of its ultimate origins or the mechanism by which its mysterious image was formed. Deep beneath the marble floors and golden altars of St. Peter's Basilica, something extraordinary waits in the shadows, something that challenges everything we think we know about death, decay, and the natural order of life itself. For centuries, the Catholic Church has preserved what they call one of their greatest mysteries: bodies that refuse to decompose, flesh that remains soft and supple decades, even centuries after death. These are the incorruptible saints, and their perfectly preserved remains continue to baffle scientists, theologians, and skeptics alike. But what makes a body incorruptible? Is it divine intervention, as the Church claims, or is there something else at work here? Something we don't yet understand about the process of death and preservation. The answers might be more unsettling than we ever imagined. The phenomenon of incorruption has been documented for over 1,000 years. When a saint's tomb is opened for examination, their body is expected to show the normal signs of decay. Bones, perhaps some dried skin, maybe fragments of clothing. Instead, what investigators often find defies explanation. Skin that looks like it could belong to someone who died yesterday. Hair that can still be combed. Eyes that seem almost alive behind closed lids. Take the case of Saint Bernadette Soubirous, the young French woman who claimed to have seen visions of the Virgin Mary at Lourdes in 1858. When she died in 1879 at the age of 35, her body was placed in a simple wooden coffin and buried in the convent grounds. 30 years later, when church officials exhumed her remains for the beatification process, they made a discovery that would puzzle investigators for generations. Her body was completely intact. Her skin was soft and flexible. Her internal organs showed no signs of decomposition. Even more remarkably, her rosary, which had been made of metal, had corroded and fallen apart, while her flesh remained perfectly preserved. How is this possible? How does organic tissue outlast metal? The Church performed multiple examinations over the years. In 1909, 1919, and 1925, independent doctors and scientists were brought in to study her remains. Each time, they found the same impossible result. No signs of artificial preservation, no evidence of embalming, no natural explanation for why her body refused to decay. But Saint Bernadette is not alone. The Church has documented over 300 cases of incorruption throughout history. Each one presents the same puzzle: bodies that should have turned to dust centuries ago, preserved as if death had simply paused rather than claimed them. Saint Catherine of Siena died in 1380. When her tomb was opened in 1430, 50 years after her death, witnesses described her body as looking like she had died only hours before. Her skin was described as soft and warm to the touch. Her limbs were flexible, as if she were merely sleeping. Even today, over 600 years after her death, her head and thumb remain on display in Siena, showing no signs of the decay that should have consumed them long ago. Then there's the curious case of Saint John Vianney, the patron saint of parish priests. When he died in 1859, his body was buried in a simple grave in the small French village of Ars. 40 years later, when church officials opened his coffin, they found something that shouldn't exist. His body was perfectly preserved, but there was something else. Something that made even the most devout believers question what they were seeing. His body appeared to have been naturally mummified, but not in the way we understand mummification. There were no signs of the traditional preservation techniques used by ancient civilizations. No evidence of chemical treatments or environmental factors that could explain the preservation. Instead, his body seemed to have been preserved by some unknown process that left his features intact and recognizable. What makes these cases even more mysterious is their inconsistency. Not all saints become incorrupt. In fact, the vast majority of canonized saints have bodies that decompose normally. There seems to be no pattern, no predictable factor that determines which bodies will be preserved and which will return to dust as nature intended. Some researchers have tried to find scientific explanations. Perhaps certain soil conditions or environmental factors could slow decomposition. Maybe some individuals have unique body chemistry that naturally resists decay. But these theories fall apart when examined closely. The incorrupt saints come from different time periods, different climates, different burial conditions. Some were buried in stone tombs, others in wooden coffins, still others in simple graves. Some were in dry climates, others in humid environments. The only common factor seems to be their supposed sanctity. Dr. Franco Bexio, an Italian physician who has studied dozens of incorrupt saints, describes the phenomenon as unprecedented in medical literature. He notes that while mummification can preserve bodies under specific conditions, incorruption is different. The bodies remain flexible, the skin retains its color and texture, and there are often reports of a sweet fragrance emanating from the remains, something that would be impossible with natural mummification or artificial preservation. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of incorruption is what happens when these bodies are examined more closely. Take the case of Saint Rita of Cassia, who died in 1457. Her body has remained incorrupt for over 500 years, but there's something else that defies explanation. On her forehead is a wound that appears fresh, as if it had been inflicted recently. According to church records, this wound appeared during her lifetime and was said to be a stigmata, a miraculous reproduction of Christ's wounds. The wound has never healed, never scarred, and never shown signs of infection, despite being exposed for centuries. Modern forensic experts who have examined incorrupt saints often describe findings that challenge their understanding of death and decay. Bodies that show no signs of bacterial activity, organs that remain intact and functional looking, blood that appears liquid rather than the thick, dark substance that should remain after death. These findings would be impossible under normal circumstances, yet they're documented again and again in case after case. The Church, of course, sees incorruption as a sign of divine intervention. They believe that God preserves the bodies of particularly holy individuals as a sign of their sanctity and as evidence of the spiritual realm's influence on the physical world. For them, incorruption is proof that death is not the end, that the soul's purity can somehow protect the body from the natural processes of decay. But what if there's another explanation? What if incorruption reveals something about consciousness, about the connection between mind and matter that we don't yet understand? Some researchers have proposed that extreme mental states, whether spiritual ecstasy or deep meditation, might trigger physiological changes that we haven't discovered yet. Could the intense spiritual practices of these saints have altered their body chemistry in ways that naturally resist decomposition? There's also the question of why incorruption seems to occur almost exclusively among Catholic saints. While other religious traditions have reported preserved bodies, the phenomenon is most commonly documented within Catholicism. Is this simply because the Catholic Church has the most extensive record-keeping system for examining saints' remains? Or is there something specific about Catholic spiritual practices that creates the conditions for incorruption? Some skeptics argue that the cases of incorruption have been exaggerated over the centuries, that medieval and Renaissance record-keeping was unreliable, and that what people described as perfect preservation was actually just better than expected preservation due to environmental factors. But this explanation becomes harder to maintain when examining modern cases with photographic documentation and scientific analysis. Saint Pio of Pietrelcina, also known as Padre Pio, died in 1968. When his body was exhumed in 2006 for reburial in a new shrine, investigators found his face perfectly preserved. Photographs from the exhumation show skin that appears fresh and lifelike, despite being underground for nearly 40 years. Modern preservation techniques were not used, and the environmental conditions in his tomb were not conducive to natural preservation. The mystery deepens when we consider the partial incorruption of some saints. Saint Teresa of Avila died in 1582. While most of her body decomposed normally, her heart was found to be perfectly preserved. When examined, the heart showed what appeared to be a deep wound or burn mark through its center. According to her own writings, Teresa claimed to have experienced visions where an angel pierced her heart with a flaming spear. Could intense psychological experiences somehow leave physical marks that persist even after death? These partial incorruptions are perhaps even more puzzling than complete body preservation. How does decay selectively avoid certain organs or body parts? What force could preserve a heart while allowing surrounding tissue to decompose naturally? Traditional science has no framework for understanding such selective preservation. The incorrupt saints also challenge our understanding of time itself. Bodies that have remained preserved for hundreds of years suddenly begin to decay when exposed to air or moved to different locations. Saint Lucy Filippini's body remained incorrupt for over 200 years, but began showing signs of decay when moved to a new location. This suggests that incorruption isn't a permanent state, but rather a delicate balance that can be disrupted by unknown factors. There are also reports of incorrupt bodies that seem to respond to their environment or to the presence of certain individuals. Some saints' bodies are said to change color or position when touched by people of particular faith or spiritual sensitivity. These accounts are difficult to verify and often dismissed as wishful thinking or religious hysteria, but they persist across cultures and centuries. The phenomenon becomes even stranger when we consider the cases where incorrupt bodies have been found to be warm to the touch, despite having no circulation or metabolic activity. Saint Charbel Makhlouf's body was reported to maintain a constant temperature above normal room temperature for years after his death in 1898. Thermal readings taken of his tomb showed consistent heat emanation that couldn't be explained by external sources. What about the reported fragrances associated with many incorrupt saints? Witnesses consistently describe a sweet, floral scent that emanates from these preserved bodies, often so strong that it fills entire rooms. This fragrance, known as the odor of sanctity, is the opposite of what we would expect from human remains. Decomposition produces distinctive and unpleasant odors due to bacterial activity and chemical breakdown. The sweet fragrances reported around incorrupt saints suggest that entirely different processes are at work. Modern attempts to recreate incorruption artificially have failed to produce the same results. Embalming preserves bodies temporarily, but creates a rigid, artificial appearance that's easily distinguished from the supple, lifelike state of incorrupt saints. Freeze drying and other preservation techniques can maintain physical structure, but don't preserve the flexibility and color that characterize true incorruption. Plastination can create permanent preservation, but results in bodies that look and feel artificial. The fact that science cannot replicate incorruption suggests that we're dealing with a phenomenon that operates outside our current understanding of biology and chemistry. Whether this points to divine intervention or unknown natural processes remains hotly debated. Some researchers have proposed that incorruption might be related to the electromagnetic properties of certain individuals. They suggest that people who achieve extreme spiritual states might develop bioelectric fields that inhibit bacterial growth and slow cellular breakdown. While this theory sounds scientific, there's currently no evidence to support it, and it doesn't explain why electromagnetic preservation would be selective, affecting only certain organs or body parts. Another theory focuses on the role of extreme fasting and ascetic practices common among many saints. Prolonged fasting can alter body chemistry, reducing fat content and changing the bacterial environment of the intestines. Some researchers wonder if these dietary practices might create conditions that naturally resist decomposition. However, this theory fails to explain why similar preservation isn't seen in other individuals who practiced extreme fasting for non-religious reasons. The psychological component of incorruption cannot be ignored. Many incorrupt saints were known for their intense spiritual experiences, including visions, ecstasies, and claims of direct communication with divine beings. Could these extraordinary mental states somehow influence physical processes in ways we don't understand? The connection between mind and body is still being explored by science, and we're constantly discovering new ways that mental states can affect physical health and biological processes. The timing of incorruption discoveries also raises questions. Many saints' bodies are found to be perfectly preserved decades or centuries after death, often coinciding with movements to canonize them or during periods of renewed religious interest. Skeptics argue that this timing is suspicious, suggesting that preservation might be artificially achieved for religious or political purposes. However, the quality and characteristics of incorruption are distinct from artificial preservation methods, making deliberate fraud difficult to achieve convincingly. There's also the matter of incorruption occurring in saints from different historical periods and geographical locations. If this were simply a medieval superstition or the result of poor record keeping, we would expect the phenomenon to be limited to certain time periods or regions. Instead, cases of incorruption are documented from the early Christian era through modern times, spanning continents and cultures. The Church's process for verifying incorruption has become increasingly rigorous over the centuries. Modern investigations involve teams of scientists, physicians, and forensic experts who examine the remains using advanced technology. These examinations often reveal details that would be impossible to fake, such as the preservation of internal organs, the flexibility of joints, and the absence of any artificial preservation chemicals. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the incorrupt saints is what their existence implies about the nature of death itself. If these bodies can resist decay for centuries, what does that tell us about the boundary between life and death? Are these individuals truly dead in the biological sense, or are they in some intermediate state that we don't have words for? The preservation of consciousness or some form of awareness in incorrupt saints is a topic that makes even believers uncomfortable. There are historical accounts of incorrupt saints' eyes following observers or their positions changing slightly over time. While these reports are often dismissed as imagination or wishful thinking, they raise disturbing questions about what might persist after what we consider biological death. Modern neuroscience tells us that consciousness depends on brain activity, and brain death is considered irreversible. Yet the incorrupt saints challenge this understanding. If their brains remain preserved and structurally intact, could some form of awareness persist? The implications are profound and deeply unsettling. The incorrupt saints force us to confront the limitations of our understanding about life, death, and the nature of human existence. Whether we attribute their preservation to divine intervention, unknown natural processes, or something else entirely, they remain as mysterious today as they were when first discovered centuries ago. As we continue to study these remarkable cases, we're left with more questions than answers. What force preserves these bodies against all natural laws? Why do some saints achieve incorruption while others don't? And perhaps most importantly, what does the existence of incorrupt saints tell us about the mysteries that still lie hidden in the intersection between the spiritual and physical worlds? The incorrupt saints stand as silent witnesses to possibilities beyond our current understanding, challenging us to expand our conception of what is possible in this strange and mysterious universe we inhabit. In the quiet corners of churches around the world, something impossible happens with disturbing regularity. Stone weeps, marble bleeds, wooden figures shed tears of blood that defy every law of physics and material science we understand. These are the bleeding statues, and for centuries they have been appearing in Catholic churches, homes, and shrines, leaving scientists baffled and believers convinced they are witnessing miracles. But what causes an inanimate object to suddenly begin bleeding? How can carved stone or molded plaster produce human blood? And why do these phenomena seem to occur most often during times of crisis, war, or social upheaval? The answers, if they exist, might reveal something far more unsettling about the nature of reality itself. The phenomenon of bleeding statues is not new. Records dating back to the 13th century describe religious statues that spontaneously began bleeding, weeping tears of blood, or producing other bodily fluids. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is their consistency across different cultures, time periods, and geographical locations. The blood always appears suddenly, without warning, and often in the presence of multiple witnesses. One of the most famous cases occurred in 1995 in the small Italian village of Civitavecchia. A statue of the Virgin Mary, owned by the Gregori family, began bleeding from its eyes on February 2nd. The blood appeared as dark red tears that flowed down the statue's cheeks, staining the white plaster face. What made this case particularly significant was the immediate response of local authorities and the Catholic Church. Within hours, police, scientists, and church officials descended on the modest family home. The statue was examined by forensic experts, who confirmed that the substance was indeed human blood. DNA analysis revealed it to be type O blood, but attempts to match it to any individual proved unsuccessful. The blood seemed to have no human source. Over the following weeks, the statue bled multiple times, always in the presence of witnesses. Television cameras captured the phenomenon as it occurred, showing blood slowly seeping from the statue's eyes and flowing down its face. The broadcast shocked Italy and drew international attention to what seemed to be an undeniable miracle occurring in real time. Dr. Luigi Garlascelli, a chemist and skeptic investigator, was among the scientists who examined the Civitavecchia statue. Despite his reputation for debunking religious phenomena, he admitted that he could find no evidence of fraud or trickery. The blood appeared spontaneously, without any visible mechanism for its production. The statue itself showed no signs of hidden reservoirs, pumps, or other devices that could produce the bleeding effect. But the Civitavecchia case is just one of hundreds documented throughout history. In medieval times, bleeding statues were often seen as omens of disaster. The chroniclers of the time recorded that statues of Christ or the Virgin Mary would begin bleeding before major battles, plagues, or political upheavals. While medieval record-keeping was less rigorous than modern standards, the consistency of these reports across different regions suggests that something genuine was being observed. The Church of St. Nicholas in Akron, Ohio, experienced a series of bleeding statue incidents in the 1980s and 90s. Multiple statues in the church began bleeding simultaneously, producing enough blood to stain the altar and surrounding areas. Chemical analysis confirmed the substance was human blood, but no source could be identified. The church was examined for hidden mechanisms, but none were found. What makes the bleeding statue phenomenon particularly puzzling is the variety of materials involved. Stone statues bleed, wooden crucifixes weep blood, plaster figures produce red tears, even painted icons on canvas have been observed bleeding. How can such different materials, with completely different physical properties, all produce the same impossible phenomenon? Traditional explanations focus on fraud or natural phenomena. Skeptics argue that all bleeding statues are the result of hoaxes, created by individuals seeking attention or attempting to boost religious tourism. They point to cases where fraud has been detected, usually involving hidden reservoirs of animal blood or other substances designed to mimic bleeding. However, this explanation becomes less convincing when examining the most well-documented cases. Many bleeding statues have appeared spontaneously in situations where fraud would be extremely difficult to orchestrate. Some have bled while under constant observation by independent witnesses. Others have been examined immediately after bleeding began, with no time for elaborate hoax preparation. The chemical composition of the blood from bleeding statues presents another puzzle. In many cases, the blood is confirmed to be human, but it often lacks certain components found in normal human blood. Sometimes the blood appears to be unusually fresh, showing no signs of coagulation or bacterial contamination despite being exposed to air for extended periods. In other cases, the blood contains cellular structures that shouldn't exist in blood that has left the human body. Dr. Richard Eby, a physician who studied multiple bleeding statue cases, noted that the blood often appears to be alive, in ways that laboratory blood samples are not. He observed that blood from bleeding statues sometimes continued to flow and remained liquid far longer than would be naturally possible. Some samples maintained their red color for months without the brownish discoloration that normally occurs as blood ages. The timing of bleeding statue phenomena is another mysterious aspect. These incidents often coincide with significant religious dates, times of community crisis, or moments of intense prayer or devotion. Some statues have been observed bleeding on specific anniversaries, such as the feast days of the saints they represent or during Holy Week. This timing suggests that the phenomenon might be triggered by psychological or spiritual factors rather than physical causes. The Weeping Madonna of Syracuse, Sicily, provides one of the most thoroughly documented cases of statue phenomena. In 1953, a small plaster statue of the Virgin Mary began weeping tears in the home of Antonina and Angelo Iannuso. The tears were initially clear, resembling normal tears, but laboratory analysis revealed them to have the same chemical composition as human tears, complete with proteins and salt content. What made the Syracuse case extraordinary was the scale of the investigation. The Catholic Church, the Italian government, and numerous scientific institutions studied the phenomenon. Over 100 people, including priests, doctors, and skeptics, witnessed the statue weeping. The tears were collected and analyzed by multiple laboratories, all confirming their human origin. The statue wept intermittently for 4 days, producing enough tears to fill several small containers. During this period, the Iannuso home was under constant observation. Investigators found no evidence of fraud, no hidden mechanisms, and no natural explanation for the phenomenon. The case was so compelling that the Catholic Church officially recognized it as a miracle in 1954. But not all bleeding statues produce blood or tears. Some produce what appears to be oil, honey, or other substances. The Madonna of Medjugorje has been associated with statues that produce a fragrant oil from their surfaces. Chemical analysis of this oil reveals a complex mixture that doesn't match any known natural or synthetic substances. The oil appears spontaneously, often in quantities that seem impossible given the size and material of the statue. Modern technology has made it increasingly difficult to dismiss bleeding statue phenomena as simple fraud. High-definition cameras, motion sensors, and chemical analysis techniques can detect even sophisticated attempts at trickery. Yet bleeding statues continue to appear under conditions that rule out conventional explanations. The case of the bleeding crucifix in Cochabamba, Bolivia, demonstrates how technology can both verify and deepen the mystery. In 2006, a wooden crucifix in a local church began bleeding from the wounds on Christ's hands and feet. The church installed security cameras to monitor the crucifix continuously. The footage shows blood appearing spontaneously on the wooden surface, with no visible human intervention. Computer analysis of the video revealed that the blood appeared to seep directly from the wood itself, as if the material were somehow producing the substance internally. Microscopic examination of the wood showed no cavities, tubes, or other structures that could contain or transport blood. The wood appeared to be solid and unchanged, except for the presence of the blood. Some researchers have proposed that bleeding statues might be related to psychokinetic phenomena, the theoretical ability of consciousness to influence matter directly. They suggest that intense religious emotion or spiritual focus might somehow trigger physical changes in religious objects. While psychokinesis remains unproven by mainstream science, the correlation between bleeding statues and times of intense religious devotion is difficult to ignore. The psychological impact of bleeding statues on witnesses is profound and consistent across cultures. People who observe these phenomena often describe feelings of awe, fear, and spiritual transformation. Many report that witnessing a bleeding statue was a turning point in their religious faith or personal life. These psychological effects are so powerful that they persist even when individuals later learn that specific cases might have been fraudulent. Dr. Michael Persinger, a neuroscientist who studied religious phenomena, suggested that bleeding statues might be related to electromagnetic fields generated by groups of people in intense emotional states. He proposed that these fields could somehow influence the molecular structure of religious objects, causing them to produce substances that weren't there before. While this theory is speculative, it attempts to provide a scientific framework for understanding seemingly impossible phenomena. The geographical distribution of bleeding statue cases reveals interesting patterns. They occur most frequently in regions with strong Catholic traditions, particularly Italy, Spain, Latin America, and Catholic communities in other countries. This distribution could simply reflect the fact that these areas have more religious statues and are more likely to report such phenomena. However, it might also suggest that cultural or psychological factors play a role in triggering the bleeding. Some of the most disturbing aspects of bleeding statue phenomena involve changes in the statues themselves beyond the production of blood. Witnesses have reported statues that appear to move slightly, change facial expressions, or even speak. While these additional phenomena are harder to verify and more likely to be psychological, they add another layer of mystery to cases that are already difficult to explain. The Madonna of Akita in Japan provides a unique case study because it combines bleeding with other phenomena. Between 1973 and 1981, a wooden statue of the Virgin Mary at a convent in Akita wept tears of blood on multiple occasions. The statue was also associated with apparent movements, changes in appearance, and messages received by Sister Agnes Sasagawa through what she described as supernatural communication. The Akita case was investigated extensively by both Japanese authorities and the Vatican. The tears were confirmed to be human blood and tears, but no source could be identified. Security cameras and constant observation ruled out fraud. The case was eventually approved by the local bishop as a genuine miracle, one of the few bleeding statue phenomena to receive official church recognition. Scientific attempts to replicate bleeding statue phenomena under laboratory conditions have consistently failed. Researchers have tried various methods to make religious statues appear to bleed naturally, including environmental manipulation, chemical treatments, and electromagnetic exposure. None of these attempts have produced results that match the characteristics observed in genuine cases. The failure to replicate bleeding statue phenomena suggests that we're dealing with something outside the normal range of physical processes. Whether this points to spiritual intervention, unknown natural forces, or some form of consciousness-matter interaction remains hotly debated. The emotional and spiritual context surrounding bleeding statues cannot be separated from the physical phenomenon. These events almost always occur in environments of intense religious devotion, community crisis, or spiritual seeking. The statues themselves are objects of veneration, focal points for prayer and meditation. This suggests that human consciousness might play a crucial role in triggering the bleeding. Quantum physics has revealed that consciousness and observation can influence physical reality at the subatomic level. While it's a huge leap to suggest that similar processes could cause statues to bleed, some researchers wonder if intense spiritual focus might somehow bridge the gap between mind and matter in ways we don't yet understand. The Catholic Church's approach to bleeding statues has evolved over the centuries. In medieval times, such phenomena were often immediately accepted as miracles. Today, the Church conducts thorough investigations before making any pronouncements about supernatural causes. The process involves scientific analysis, witness testimony, and extensive documentation before a bleeding statue can be officially recognized as miraculous. This more rigorous approach has actually strengthened the credibility of some bleeding statue cases. When the Church, with all its resources and expertise, cannot find a natural explanation for a phenomenon, it carries significant weight. The Church has a vested interest in avoiding embarrassing hoaxes, so their acceptance of certain cases as genuine is particularly noteworthy. The long-term effects of bleeding statue phenomena on communities are profound. Towns and villages where bleeding statues have appeared often become pilgrimage sites, drawing visitors from around the world. The local economy may be transformed, but more importantly, these communities often report lasting changes in religious devotion and social cohesion. The statue in Civitavecchia, for example, continues to draw thousands of visitors years after the bleeding episodes ended. The Gregori family's home has become an informal shrine, and the town has embraced its role as a site of miraculous occurrence. Whether or not the bleeding was truly miraculous, its impact on the community has been undeniably real. Some bleeding statue cases have been associated with prophecies or messages, adding another dimension to the mystery. The messages typically warn of future disasters, call for increased prayer and devotion, or predict significant religious events. While most of these prophecies are vague enough to be interpreted in multiple ways, some have been remarkably specific and accurate. The connection between bleeding statues and prophecy suggests that these phenomena might be more than just unusual physical events. They might represent a form of communication, a way for some higher intelligence to convey information to human beings. This interpretation moves the phenomenon firmly into the realm of the supernatural, beyond what current science can address. Modern bleeding statue cases continue to appear with surprising regularity. In the age of smartphones and social media, videos and photographs of bleeding statues can spread globally within hours. This has led to increased scrutiny, but also to more documented cases. The ease of recording and sharing has made it more difficult to dismiss these phenomena as isolated incidents or cultural myths. The consistency of witness reports across different bleeding statue cases is remarkable. People describe the blood as appearing suddenly, often starting as small drops that grow into flowing streams. The blood is typically described as bright red and fresh-looking, unlike the dark, coagulated appearance of old blood. Witnesses often report feeling a presence or spiritual energy when the bleeding occurs. These consistent details across hundreds of cases, spanning centuries and continents, suggest that we're dealing with a real phenomenon rather than collective hallucination or cultural storytelling. The specificity and consistency of the reports indicate that people are observing something genuine, even if we can't explain what it is. The theological implications of bleeding statues are profound for believers. If these phenomena are genuine, they suggest that the spiritual realm can directly influence the physical world. They provide tangible evidence of divine intervention in human affairs, confirming religious beliefs about the reality of the supernatural. For skeptics, bleeding statues represent the persistence of superstition in an age of scientific rationalism. They argue that these phenomena, however mysterious they might seem, must have natural explanations that we simply haven't discovered yet. The inability to explain something doesn't make it supernatural, they contend. It just makes it unexplained. The truth about bleeding statues probably lies somewhere between miracle and fraud, in a gray area that challenges both religious faith and scientific materialism. These phenomena force us to confront the limitations of our understanding and to consider possibilities that don't fit neatly into our current worldview. As we continue to study bleeding statues with increasingly sophisticated technology and methodology, we may eventually find natural explanations for these mysterious phenomena. Or we may discover that they represent something entirely outside our current scientific framework, something that requires us to expand our understanding of reality itself. Until then, the bleeding statues remain as enigmatic as ever, silent witnesses to mysteries that continue to challenge everything we think we know about the boundary between the possible and the impossible, the natural and the supernatural, the physical and the spiritual. On October 13, 1917, something extraordinary happened in a small Portuguese town that would forever change the lives of thousands and leave scientists scratching their heads for over a century. What occurred that day in Fatima was witnessed by an estimated 70,000 people, yet it remains one of the most controversial and unexplained events in recorded history. Was it divine intervention, a mass hallucination, or something else entirely that defied the very laws of physics as we understand them? The story begins months earlier, in the spring of 1917, when 3 young shepherd children claimed they had encountered the Virgin Mary while tending their flocks in the hills outside Fatima. Lucia dos Santos, age 10, and her younger cousins Francisco and Jacinta Mardo, ages 9 and 7, said a beautiful lady dressed in white had appeared to them near a small oak tree. The lady, they claimed, asked them to return to the same spot on the 13th of each month and promised to reveal her identity and perform a great miracle that would make everyone believe. At first, the children's families were skeptical, even angry. This was a time of great political upheaval in Portugal. The country had recently abolished the monarchy and established a secular republic that was openly hostile to the Catholic Church. Religious gatherings were discouraged, and the authorities viewed any claims of divine visions with deep suspicion. The children's parents worried that their stories would bring unwanted attention from the government, potentially putting the entire family at risk. But the children persisted in their claims. Each month they returned to the same oak tree, and each time they said the lady appeared to them. Word began to spread throughout the region. At first, only a few curious neighbors accompanied the children to their monthly appointments, but as the months passed, the crowds grew larger. By August, hundreds of people were gathering at the site, hoping to witness something miraculous themselves. The children described the lady in vivid detail. She was young and beautiful, dressed in a white robe that seemed to glow with its own light. She wore a golden crown and held a rosary made of pearls. Her feet barely touched the branches of the small oak tree where she appeared, and her voice was soft but clear. Through the children, she delivered messages about prayer, penance, and the need for humanity to turn away from sin. She also shared what the children called secrets, prophecies about future events that would not be fully revealed until decades later. What made the situation even more intriguing was that only the children could see and hear the lady. The growing crowds of onlookers saw nothing but 3 young children kneeling by a tree, apparently speaking to empty air. Yet many witnesses reported strange phenomena during these encounters. The temperature would drop noticeably, even on hot summer days. The leaves of the oak tree would bend and sway as if responding to an invisible presence. Some people claimed they could hear a faint buzzing sound like bees, but no insects were ever found. Local authorities grew increasingly concerned about the gatherings. In August, the mayor of nearby Orange, a man named Arturo Santos, who was strongly opposed to the Catholic Church, decided to take action. He had the 3 children arrested and brought them to his office for questioning. He threatened them with imprisonment, even death, if they did not admit their visions were lies. But the children refused to recant their story. They maintained that the lady had appeared to them, and that she would perform a great miracle in October that would prove the truth of their claims. The arrest of the children only served to increase public interest in their story. When they were finally released and allowed to return home, even larger crowds began gathering for the monthly apparitions. By September, thousands of people were making pilgrimages to Fatima, coming from all across Portugal and even from neighboring countries. The situation was becoming a significant challenge for local authorities, who struggled to maintain order among the massive crowds. The children continued to insist that the lady had promised a great miracle would occur during her final appearance on October 13th. This prediction was reported widely in Portuguese newspapers, many of which were skeptical and expected the promised miracle to fail spectacularly, thereby discrediting the children's claims once and for all. Some newspapers even sent reporters to Fatima to witness what they assumed would be the embarrassing end to the whole affair. On the morning of October 13th, an estimated 70,000 people had gathered in the Cova de Iria, the field where the apparitions had been taking place. It was a cold, rainy day, and the crowd huddled together in the mud, waiting to see what would happen. Among the witnesses were people from all walks of life: devout Catholics, skeptics, journalists, government officials, doctors, and scientists. Many had come hopping to witness a miracle, while others were there simply out of curiosity or to debunk what they saw as religious superstition. At noon, the children arrived at the oak tree and knelt down to pray. As they had done each month before, they began speaking to someone that only they could see. Lucia, the oldest of the 3, served as the primary spokesperson, asking questions and relaying the lady's responses to the crowd. The gathering waited in tense anticipation, many wondering if anything would happen at all. Then, at approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, something extraordinary occurred. The rain stopped abruptly, and the thick clouds that had been covering the sky began to part. The sun, which had been hidden behind the heavy cloud cover all morning, suddenly became visible. But this was not the sun as people normally knew it. What appeared in the sky seemed to defy every natural law. Witnesses described the sun as looking like a silver disk that could be stared at directly without hurting their eyes. It began to spin rapidly, throwing off rays of multicolored light that bathed the entire landscape in shifting hues of red, yellow, blue, and green. The spinning motion became more and more intense, and then the impossible happened. The sun appeared to detach itself from its fixed position in the sky and began to dance, zigzagging back and forth in wild, erratic movements. But the most terrifying moment came when the sun seemed to plunge directly toward the earth. Thousands of people screamed in terror, believing they were about to be incinerated. Some fell to their knees in prayer, others ran for cover, and many believed they were witnessing the end of the world. The enormous disk of light appeared to be hurtling straight down toward the crowd, growing larger and more intense as it approached. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the phenomenon stopped. The sun returned to its normal position in the sky, appearing exactly as it always had. The immediate terror gave way to wonder and confusion as people tried to process what they had just experienced. But there was another surprise waiting for them. Despite the fact that it had been raining heavily all morning and the crowd had been standing in mud, everyone's clothes were completely dry. The muddy field had also dried up entirely, as if the rain had never fallen at all. The testimonies from that day are remarkable in their consistency. People from all different backgrounds, many of whom had been skeptical of the children's claims, described essentially the same phenomenon. Dr. José María de Almeida Garrett, a professor at the University of Coimbra and a man of science, was among the witnesses. He described the sun as appearing like a disk of snow that could be looked at without discomfort, spinning rapidly and throwing off beams of colored light. He noted that the phenomenon lasted approximately 10 minutes and that he had never seen anything like it in his life. Avelino de Almeida, a journalist from O Século, one of Portugal's most prominent newspapers, had come to Fatima expecting to debunk the children's claims. Instead, he found himself writing one of the most famous newspaper accounts of the miracle. He described how the sun appeared to tremble and make sudden movements unlike anything in normal experience, dancing in the sky in a way that caused the massive crowd to cry out in terror and wonder. But perhaps one of the most compelling aspects of the testimonies is that they came from people who were not at Fatima that day. Reports began to surface of individuals who had been miles away from the site who also witnessed the unusual solar phenomenon. Some witnesses claimed to have seen the dancing sun from distances of up to 25 miles from Fatima. This detail has puzzled researchers for decades, as it suggests that whatever happened was not simply a localized optical illusion or mass hysteria confined to the crowd at Fatima. The three children, meanwhile, claimed that during the solar miracle, the Virgin Mary had finally revealed her identity to them. She told them she was the Lady of the Rosary and asked that a chapel be built at the site in her honor. She also entrusted them with 3 secrets, prophecies that would remain hidden for years. The first 2 secrets were revealed in 1942 and concerned visions of hell and predictions about World War II and the rise of communism. The third secret remained sealed in the Vatican archives until the year 2000, when it was finally revealed to be a vision of the persecution of Christians and an attempt on the Pope's life. In the weeks and months following the miracle, investigators from the Catholic Church began conducting detailed interviews with witnesses and examining the evidence. The Church's approach was notably cautious and methodical. They were well aware that claims of miraculous events could easily be explained by natural phenomena, psychological factors, or outright deception. Teams of theologians, doctors, and other experts spent years studying the testimonies and looking for alternative explanations for what had occurred. One of the most thorough investigations was conducted by Canon Manuel Nunes Formigao, a professor and theologian who interviewed dozens of witnesses individually. His records, which still exist today, show remarkable consistency in the testimonies, despite the fact that the witnesses came from different social backgrounds and had varying levels of education. Children and adults, believers and skeptics, educated professionals and simple farmers all described essentially the same phenomenon. Scientists have proposed various theories to explain what happened at Fatima. Some have suggested that the witnesses experienced a mass hallucination brought on by staring at the sun for extended periods. Prolonged solar staring can indeed cause visual disturbances and the appearance of the sun moving or changing colors. However, this theory fails to explain several key aspects of the Fatima event. First, many witnesses reported that they were able to look directly at the sun without any discomfort, which is not typical of normal solar observation. Second, the phenomenon was witnessed by people who were not staring at the sun when it began, including some who were looking in other directions entirely. Another theory suggests that unusual atmospheric conditions may have created an optical illusion. High-altitude ice crystals, dust particles, or other atmospheric phenomena can sometimes cause unusual visual effects around the sun. Some researchers have proposed that a layer of dust from the Sahara Desert, carried by wind patterns, might have created the conditions necessary for the observed phenomenon. While this could potentially explain the unusual appearance of the sun, it does not account for the synchronized movements described by witnesses, or the fact that the phenomenon was observed over such a wide geographic area. Meteorologists have also examined weather records from October 13, 1917, looking for unusual atmospheric conditions that might explain the event. While the day was indeed rainy and cloudy, there is no record of any extraordinary weather phenomena that would account for the testimonies. The sudden cessation of rain and the immediate drying of clothes and ground remain unexplained by conventional meteorological science. Psychological explanations have also been proposed, with some researchers suggesting that the crowd experienced a form of collective hysteria or mass suggestion. The theory is that the intense religious excitement and expectation created a psychological state in which people were susceptible to shared hallucinations. However, this explanation is complicated by the fact that many witnesses were skeptics who had not expected to see anything miraculous. Additionally, the phenomenon was reported by people who were at various distances from the main crowd and were not caught up in the same emotional atmosphere. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Fatima event is the physical evidence, or rather, the lack thereof. Unlike many claimed miracles, the solar phenomenon at Fatima left no measurable physical trace. Astronomical observatories around the world recorded no unusual solar activity on October 13, 1917. If the sun had actually moved as described by witnesses, such movement would have been detectable by instruments and would have had catastrophic effects on Earth's gravitational and tidal systems. The fact that no such effects were recorded has led some researchers to conclude that whatever the witnesses saw, it was not the actual sun behaving abnormally. This has given rise to theories about localized phenomena that affected only the region around Fatima. Some researchers have speculated about unknown atmospheric or electromagnetic effects that could create convincing illusions without affecting the sun itself. Others have proposed more exotic explanations, including the possibility of some form of advanced technology or even extraterrestrial intervention, though such theories lack any supporting evidence. The Catholic Church's official position on the Fatima events was established after 13 years of investigation. In 1930, the Bishop of Leiria declared the apparitions worthy of belief, and the site was approved for Catholic pilgrimage and devotion. However, the Church has been careful to distinguish between accepting the spiritual significance of the events and making claims about the physical nature of the miracle. The Church recognizes that something extraordinary occurred that strengthened the faith of many people, but it does not insist on any particular scientific explanation for the phenomenon. The long-term impact of the Fatima events has been profound. The site has become one of the most important Catholic pilgrimage destinations in the world, visited by millions of people each year. 3 popes have made official visits to Fatima, and the site has been the location of numerous other reported miraculous healings and spiritual experiences. The 3 child visionaries were all eventually recognized as blessed by the Catholic Church, with Francisco and Jacinta being canonized as saints in 2017, exactly 100 years after the original apparitions. But the scientific mystery remains unsolved. Despite more than a century of investigation, no definitive explanation for the solar phenomenon at Fatima has been established. The testimonies remain consistent and compelling, involving thousands of witnesses, including many who had no religious motivation to fabricate or exaggerate their accounts. The event continues to be studied by researchers from various fields, including psychology, atmospheric science, and anomalous phenomena research. What makes Fatima particularly intriguing is not just the extraordinary nature of what was reported, but the fact that it was predicted in advance. The children had announced for months that a great miracle would occur on a specific date, and thousands of people gathered specifically to witness this promised event. This eliminates many of the explanations that might apply to spontaneous anomalous phenomena, as the witnesses came with clear expectations, and many were actively looking for evidence of deception or natural explanations. The drying of clothes and ground immediately after the phenomenon remains one of the most puzzling physical aspects of the event. Multiple witnesses, including skeptical journalists, reported that their rain-soaked clothing became completely dry within minutes of the solar display ending. The muddy field where 70,000 people had been standing also dried up entirely. From a physics standpoint, this rapid evaporation of moisture would require an enormous amount of energy, yet no one reported feeling excessive heat or any other effects that would normally accompany such rapid drying. Some modern researchers have attempted to recreate possible atmospheric conditions that might explain aspects of the Fatima phenomenon. Computer simulations and laboratory experiments have explored how various combinations of humidity, temperature, and particulate matter might create unusual optical effects. While some of these studies have produced interesting results, none have successfully replicated all the aspects of what was reported at Fatima, particularly the coordinated nature of the phenomenon and its wide geographic visibility. The psychological impact of the Fatima events extends far beyond the immediate witnesses. The story has been retold countless times in books, films, and documentaries, each adding its own interpretation to the events. For believers, Fatima represents clear evidence of divine intervention in human affairs, a sign that higher powers are watching over humanity and occasionally choose to make their presence known. For skeptics, it represents the power of mass suggestion and the human tendency to interpret ambiguous events in supernatural terms. Yet the Fatima mystery refuses to fit neatly into either category. The sheer number of witnesses, their diverse backgrounds, and the consistency of their testimonies create a compelling case that something genuinely unusual occurred. At the same time, the lack of physical evidence and the absence of any accepted scientific mechanism for the reported phenomena leave room for doubt and alternative interpretations. As we continue to advance in our understanding of atmospheric science, psychology, and physics, new theories occasionally emerge to explain the Fatima events. Some researchers have explored the possibility that solar activity, while not detectable by early 20th century instruments, might have created unusual electromagnetic fields that affected perception. Others have investigated whether rare atmospheric phenomena, such as previously unknown types of light refraction or reflection, might account for the testimonies. But perhaps the most enduring mystery is not what happened in the sky above Fatima, but what it reveals about the nature of human experience and the limits of our scientific understanding. The event demonstrates how much we still don't know about consciousness, perception, and the complex relationship between objective reality and subjective experience. Whether the miracle was divine, natural, or something else entirely, it remains a profound reminder that our universe still holds mysteries that challenge our most basic assumptions about how the world works. In the quiet Bavarian town of Klingenberg am Main, a young woman's descent into what appeared to be demonic possession would become one of the most controversial and thoroughly documented cases of exorcism in modern history. The story of Anneliese Michel is not just a tale of supernatural terror, but a complex intersection of faith, mental health, and the eternal human struggle to understand the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. What happened to this devout Catholic university student between 1975 and 1976 would challenge medical professionals, theologians, and legal experts, leaving questions that remain unanswered decades later. Anneliese Michel was born on September 21, 1952, into a deeply religious Catholic family in Leibelfing, Germany. Her parents, Joseph and Anna Michel, were devout churchgoers who raised their 4 daughters in strict accordance with Catholic teachings. The family attended Mass regularly, observed all religious holidays, and instilled in their children a profound respect for church doctrine and tradition. Anneliese herself was known as an exceptionally pious child who took her faith seriously from an early age. Growing up, Anneliese was described by those who knew her as intelligent, caring, and deeply spiritual. She was an excellent student who showed particular interest in literature and languages. After completing her secondary education, she enrolled at the University of Wurzburg to study education, with plans to become a teacher. Those who knew her during this period remember her as hardworking and dedicated, someone who balanced her academic pursuits with regular prayer and church attendance. But beneath this normal exterior, troubling signs were beginning to emerge. In 1968, when Anneliese was just 16 years old, she experienced her first unexplained episode. She was attending a movie with friends when she suddenly became rigid and unresponsive. She couldn't speak or move, and her friends had to carry her home. When she finally regained consciousness, she had no memory of what had happened. Her parents took her to see a doctor, but no clear medical explanation could be found for the episode. Over the following months, similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency. Anneliese would suddenly freeze up, becoming completely catatonic for minutes or sometimes hours at a time. During these episodes, she would sometimes report seeing terrifying visions or hearing voices that others could not perceive. Her family became increasingly concerned, and they sought help from multiple medical professionals, including neurologists and psychiatrists. The medical establishment initially diagnosed Anneliese with temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition that can cause seizures, hallucinations, and alterations in consciousness. She was prescribed anticonvulsant medications and underwent various treatments designed to control her symptoms. For a while, the medication seemed to help, and the frequency of her episodes decreased. She was able to continue her studies at university and maintain a relatively normal social life. However, in 1973, Anneliese's condition took a disturbing turn. The seizure-like episodes returned with greater intensity, and she began exhibiting behaviors that were increasingly difficult to explain through conventional medical diagnoses. She would speak in voices that were completely different from her own, sometimes claiming to be historical figures or demonic entities. During these episodes, her personality would change dramatically, and she would demonstrate knowledge of languages and subjects that she had never studied. One of the most unsettling aspects of Anneliese's condition was her reaction to religious objects and imagery. A young woman who had previously found great comfort in her faith now seemed to be tormented by it. She would become violently agitated when presented with crosses, holy water, or religious statues. She would refuse to enter churches and would become physically ill when forced to do so. Her prayers, which had once brought her peace, now seemed to cause her intense distress. The voices that Anneliese claimed to hear became more frequent and more disturbing. She said they were telling her to commit acts of violence against herself and others. She began exhibiting self-destructive behaviors, including refusing to eat for extended periods and engaging in compulsive actions that caused her physical harm. Her academic performance suffered dramatically, and she was eventually unable to continue her university studies. Her family watched in horror as their once gentle daughter seemed to transform into someone they barely recognized. During her episodes, she would speak in deep, masculine voices that were completely unlike her natural speaking voice. She would make references to events and people from centuries past, displaying detailed knowledge that seemed impossible for a young German woman to possess. She would curse fluently in languages she had never learned and demonstrate physical strength that far exceeded her normal capabilities. Medical professionals continued to treat Anneliese with various medications and therapies, but her condition only seemed to worsen. Psychiatrists diagnosed her with several different conditions, including psychosis, depression, and various personality disorders. She was hospitalized multiple times and underwent numerous treatments, including electroconvulsive therapy, but nothing provided lasting relief from her symptoms. It was during this period that Anneliese's family began to consider the possibility that her condition might have a spiritual rather than medical cause. As devout Catholics, they were familiar with the Church's teachings about demonic possession and exorcism. The behaviors they were witnessing in their daughter seemed to match many of the classical signs that the Catholic Church associated with demonic influence: aversion to religious objects, speaking in unknown languages, supernatural strength, and knowledge of hidden things. In 1974, the Michel family approached their local parish priest, seeking guidance about their daughter's condition. The priest initially encouraged them to continue pursuing medical treatment, as the Catholic Church generally requires that all medical possibilities be exhausted before considering exorcism. However, as Anneliese's condition continued to deteriorate despite ongoing medical intervention, church officials began to take their concerns more seriously. The process of obtaining permission for an exorcism within the Catholic Church is typically lengthy and rigorous. Church doctrine requires that several criteria be met before an exorcism can be authorized. The person must demonstrate supernatural strength, must speak in languages they have never learned, must reveal hidden knowledge, and must show aversion to sacred objects. Additionally, medical professionals must be unable to provide an adequate explanation for the symptoms. In Anneliese's case, church investigators found that she appeared to meet all of these criteria. During interviews with church officials, she demonstrated abilities that seemed to defy natural explanation. She would speak fluently in Latin, a language she had never formally studied, often using theological terms and concepts that were far beyond her known education. She would reveal personal details about the lives of priests and church officials that she could not have known through normal means. Perhaps most convincing to church authorities was the physical transformation that occurred during Anneliese's episodes. Witnesses described her face becoming distorted in ways that seemed impossible through normal muscle contractions. Her voice would change not just in tone, but in quality, sometimes speaking simultaneously in multiple voices. She would exhibit physical strength that required multiple adults to restrain her, despite the fact that she was a small, often malnourished young woman. In September 1975, Bishop Joseph Stangl of the Diocese of Wurzburg granted permission for an exorcism to be performed on Anneliese Michel. The ritual would be conducted according to the traditional Roman Catholic rite, a ceremony that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. 2 priests were assigned to perform the exorcism: Father Arnold Rentz, an experienced pastor, and Father Ernst Alt, who had previous experience with exorcism cases. The exorcism of Anneliese Michel was unlike the brief, dramatic rituals often depicted in popular media. Instead, it was a prolonged, exhausting process that would continue for 10 months, from September 1975 until July 1976. During this period, the 2 priests would visit the Michel family home twice per week, conducting lengthy sessions designed to drive out the demonic entities that they believed had taken possession of Anneliese. What makes this case particularly significant from a historical and scientific perspective is that many of these exorcism sessions were recorded on audio tape. The Michel family and the participating priests documented over 40 hours of the rituals, creating an unprecedented record of what they believed to be genuine demonic possession and exorcism. These recordings, which still exist today, provide a disturbing window into what Anneliese experienced during this period. The audio recordings reveal the voices that claim to be possessing Anneliese. According to the priests and family members involved, 6 different demonic entities had taken control of her: Judas Iscariot, the apostle who betrayed Jesus; Nero, the Roman emperor who persecuted Christians; Adolf Hitler; Cain, the biblical figure who killed his brother Abel; Lucifer himself; and a disgraced priest named Fleshman who had been defrocked in the 16th century. Each of these entities supposedly spoke through Anneliese with distinct voices and personalities. During the exorcism sessions, these voices would engage in extended dialogues with the priests, often displaying detailed theological knowledge and making references to obscure historical events. The entity claiming to be Hitler would speak in the dialect associated with his region of Austria and would make references to specific events from World War II. The voice claiming to be Judas would quote biblical passages in ancient languages and would express remorse for his betrayal of Jesus. The physical toll of these extended exorcism sessions on Anneliese was severe. She would thrash violently for hours, often injuring herself in the process. She would refuse food for days at a time, claiming that the demons would not allow her to eat. Her weight dropped dramatically, and she developed numerous injuries from her violent movements during the sessions. Photographs from this period show a dramatic physical transformation, with Anneliese appearing gaunt and hollow-eyed, bearing little resemblance to the healthy young woman she had been just a few years earlier. Throughout this ordeal, medical professionals continued to urge that Anneliese receive psychiatric treatment. However, her family and the participating priests believed that medical intervention would be ineffective against what they saw as a supernatural problem. They argued that previous medical treatments had failed to provide relief, and that the symptoms Anneliese was experiencing were clearly beyond the scope of natural medicine. The case became increasingly tragic as Anneliese's physical condition deteriorated. She was eating very little and was losing weight rapidly. The violent physical episodes during exorcism sessions were causing injuries that weren't healing properly. By early 1976, she was severely malnourished and physically weakened, yet the exorcism sessions continued with the belief that they were making progress against the possessing demons. On July 1, 1976, Anneliese Michel died at her family home. She was just 23 years old. The official cause of death was determined to be malnutrition and dehydration, complications that arose from her refusal to eat and the physical demands of the prolonged exorcism process. At the time of her death, she weighed only 68 pounds, having lost nearly 70 pounds over the course of the exorcism period. The death of Anneliese Michel immediately became a major controversy that attracted international attention. Critics argued that she had been the victim of religious fanaticism and medical neglect, that she had died from treatable mental illness because her family and the Catholic Church had chosen supernatural explanations over proper medical care. Supporters countered that she had been genuinely possessed and that the exorcism had been a valiant attempt to save her soul from demonic influence. German authorities launched a criminal investigation into Anneliese's death. In 1978, her parents and the two priests who had performed the exorcism were charged with negligent homicide. The prosecution argued that they had allowed Anneliese to die by failing to seek proper medical treatment for her condition. The case went to trial and became a media sensation, with extensive coverage in newspapers and television programs around the world. During the trial, the defense presented the audio recordings of the exorcism sessions as evidence that Anneliese had been genuinely possessed. They argued that the voices captured on tape demonstrated supernatural knowledge and abilities that could not be explained through conventional psychiatric diagnoses. Expert witnesses testified about the theological aspects of possession and exorcism, while medical experts debated whether Anneliese's symptoms could have been treated through psychiatric intervention. The prosecution, meanwhile, argued that Anneliese had been suffering from severe mental illness that should have been treated with medication and therapy. They presented evidence that she had been diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy and psychosis years earlier, and that proper medical treatment could have managed her symptoms. They contended that the belief in demonic possession had prevented her from receiving the care she needed to survive. After a lengthy trial, the court reached a compromise verdict. Anneliese's parents and the two priests were found guilty of negligent homicide, but were given suspended sentences. The court ruled that while they genuinely believed they were helping Anneliese, their failure to seek adequate medical care had contributed to her death. The verdict satisfied neither side completely, with believers feeling that the supernatural aspects of the case had been dismissed, while skeptics felt that the sentences were too lenient. The scientific and medical communities have generally approached the Anneliese Michel case with significant skepticism. Most mental health professionals who have studied the available evidence conclude that she was suffering from severe psychiatric illness, most likely involving psychosis. dissociative disorders, and possibly temporal lobe epilepsy, as originally diagnosed. They argue that the symptoms described by her family and the priests can be explained through known psychological and neurological conditions. The phenomenon of speaking in unknown languages, known as glossolalia or xenoglossy, has been observed in various psychiatric conditions. Patients with certain types of seizure disorders, dissociative conditions, or psychotic episodes can sometimes produce speech patterns that sound like foreign languages, but are actually nonsensical combinations of sounds that mimic linguistic patterns the person has been exposed to previously. The apparent theological knowledge displayed during Anneliese's episodes could be explained by her extensive religious education and the deep immersion in Catholic doctrine that characterized her upbringing. The physical transformations reported during Anneliese's episodes are also not unprecedented in psychiatric literature. Patients experiencing severe psychotic episodes or dissociative states can exhibit dramatic changes in facial expression, body language, and even apparent physical strength. The stress response associated with intense psychological states can produce temporary increases in physical capability and pain tolerance that might appear supernatural to observers unfamiliar with such phenomena. However, some aspects of Anneliese's case continue to puzzle even skeptical researchers. The consistency and detail of the different personalities that emerged during her episodes were remarkable, with each supposedly possessing entity maintaining distinct speech patterns, historical knowledge, and behavioral characteristics across multiple sessions over many months. The audio recordings reveal what appears to be simultaneous speaking in multiple voices, a phenomenon that is difficult to explain through conventional understanding of human vocal capabilities. The case has also raised important questions about the intersection of religious belief and mental health treatment. Critics argue that Anneliese's death demonstrates the dangers of prioritizing spiritual explanations over medical intervention when dealing with severe mental illness. They contend that modern psychiatric medicine could have provided effective treatment for her symptoms and prevented her tragic death. Supporters of the exorcism, however, maintain that Anneliese's case represented genuine supernatural phenomena that were beyond the scope of medical treatment. They point to the failure of previous medical interventions to provide lasting relief and argue that the symptoms she exhibited were clearly indicative of demonic possession rather than mental illness. From this perspective, the exorcism was an appropriate response to a spiritual problem that medical science was unable to address. The Catholic Church's official position on the Anneliese Michel case has evolved over the decades since her death. While the Church continues to recognize the validity of exorcism as a spiritual remedy for demonic possession, it has also emphasized the importance of ensuring that medical and psychiatric evaluations are thoroughly completed before considering supernatural explanations. The Church has implemented stricter guidelines for authorizing exorcisms and requires more extensive medical documentation before proceeding with such rituals. Modern exorcists within the Catholic Church are typically required to work closely with medical professionals and to ensure that individuals seeking exorcism receive appropriate psychiatric evaluation and treatment. The Church recognizes that many symptoms traditionally associated with demonic possession can be effectively treated through medical intervention, and that genuine possession cases are extremely rare. The influence of the Anneliese Michel case extends far beyond academic debates about possession and mental health. Her story has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films, including The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which brought her case to mainstream popular culture. These dramatizations have often taken significant liberties with the facts of the case, but they have helped to maintain public interest in questions about the nature of evil, the reality of supernatural phenomena, and the limits of scientific understanding. For families dealing with severe mental illness, The Anneliese Michel case serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of ongoing confusion. The tragic outcome of her case demonstrates the potential consequences of avoiding or delaying appropriate medical treatment for psychiatric conditions. At the same time, the case continues to be cited by those who believe that some forms of extreme behavioral disturbance may have spiritual rather than medical causes. Researchers continue to study the available evidence from Anneliese's case, including the extensive audio recordings and witness testimonies. While most scientific analyses conclude that her symptoms were consistent with known psychiatric conditions, some researchers have noted unusual aspects of the case that remain difficult to explain through conventional medical understanding. The simultaneous voices captured on recordings, the detailed historical knowledge displayed by different personalities, and the dramatic physical transformations witnessed by multiple observers continue to generate debate and investigation. The ethical dimensions of the case also remain relevant to modern discussions about mental health treatment, religious freedom, and the rights of individuals to make decisions about their own medical care. Anneliese was a legal adult who, according to her family and the participating priests, consented to the exorcism process and believed it was necessary for her spiritual well-being. This raises complex questions about autonomy, informed consent, and the role of religious beliefs in medical decision-making. As our understanding of neuroscience, psychology, and consciousness continues to advance, the Anneliese Michel case may eventually yield new insights into the nature of severe mental illness and the complex relationship between brain function and subjective experience. The detailed documentation of her case, including the audio recordings and extensive witness testimonies, provides a unique resource for researchers studying extreme alterations of consciousness and identity. But perhaps the most enduring mystery of Anneliese Michel's story is not whether she was truly possessed by demons or suffering from mental illness, but what her case reveals about the fundamental human struggle to understand the nature of consciousness, identity, and the boundaries between the known and unknown aspects of existence. Her tragic story continues to challenge our assumptions about reality and reminds us that despite all our scientific advances, there are still aspects of human experience that defy easy explanation or categorization. Deep within the monastery walls of San Giovanni Rotondo in the Italian countryside, something extraordinary was happening. Every morning for 50 years, a Franciscan friar would wake up bleeding, not from injuries or accidents, but from wounds that appeared spontaneously on his hands, feet, and side. Wounds that perfectly matched the crucifixion wounds of Jesus Christ. This wasn't folklore or legend. This was documented medical reality, witnessed by thousands of people, photographed, and examined by doctors who couldn't explain what they were seeing. The man at the center of this mystery was Francesco Forgiani, better known to the world as Padre Pio, and his story challenges everything we think we know about the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual world. Born in 1867 in the small town of Pietrelcina, Francesco seemed destined for an ordinary life in rural Italy. His family were farmers, deeply religious but unremarkable in most ways. Yet from childhood, young Francesco claimed to experience visions. He spoke of conversations with Jesus, the Virgin Mary, and his guardian angel as if they were as real as talking to his neighbors. His parents, while devout Catholics, were initially skeptical of their son's claims. But Francesco's devotion was undeniable. He would spend hours in prayer, often falling into trances so deep that his family couldn't wake him. Neighbors began to notice something different about the boy. Some claimed they could see a glow around him during prayer. Others reported the scent of roses appearing wherever he went, even when no flowers were present. At the age of 15, Francesco joined the Capuchin Franciscan order, taking the name Pio in honor of St. Pius V. His early years as a novice were marked by illness and what his superiors described as unusual spiritual phenomena. Fellow monks reported that during prayer, Padre Pio would sometimes levitate several inches off the ground. Others claimed to witness him appearing in two places at once, a phenomenon the Catholic Church calls bilocation. But these were just the beginning of the mysteries that would surround Padre Pio for the rest of his life. On September 20th, 1918, something unprecedented happened. Padre Pio was praying before a crucifix in the monastery chapel when he suddenly cried out in pain. Blood began flowing from his hands, feet, and side. The wounds that appeared were not random cuts or scratches. They were precise, clean openings that matched exactly the wounds Christ would have received during crucifixion. 2 holes in each hand where nails would have been driven through, 2 more in his feet, and a gash in his side corresponding to the spear wound inflicted by a Roman soldier. This was stigmata, one of the rarest and most controversial phenomena in religious history. The word comes from the Greek term for marks or brands, and it refers to the spontaneous appearance of Christ's crucifixion wounds on a living person. While the Catholic Church has documented numerous cases of stigmata over the centuries, most fade within days or weeks. Padre Pio's wounds would remain open and bleeding for the next 50 years, until just before his death in 1968. What made Padre Pio's stigmata even more extraordinary was its public nature. Unlike many stigmatics who lived in seclusion, Padre Pio continued his duties as a priest. He celebrated Mass daily, heard confessions, and blessed pilgrims, all while blood seeped through bandages wrapped around his hands. Thousands of people witnessed the wounds firsthand. They were photographed extensively. Medical experts from around the world came to examine them. Dr. Giorgio Festa, a surgeon from Rome, was one of the first physicians to study Padre Pio's wounds. His examination in 1919 revealed something that defied medical explanation. The wounds were perfectly symmetrical, passing completely through his hands from palm to back. They showed no signs of infection despite being constantly exposed. Most puzzling of all, they appeared to be maintained by some unknown force. Normal wounds either heal or become infected. These did neither. Dr. Festa noted that the wounds had clean, precise edges, as if they had been made by a surgical instrument, but they showed no signs of being self-inflicted. There was no scarring around the edges, no evidence of repeated cutting or injury. The flesh around each wound was healthy and normal. It was as if the wounds had simply appeared and were being held open by some invisible force. Over the years, dozens of doctors would examine Padre Pio's stigmata. Each reached the same conclusion. The wounds were genuine and inexplicable by medical science. Dr. Luigi Romanelli, chief physician at Barletta Hospital, conducted multiple examinations and documented his findings in detail. He noted that the wounds never showed signs of suppuration, the formation of pus that typically occurs in open wounds. They bled regularly but never excessively. Most mysteriously, they maintained their exact size and shape for decades. The Vatican, initially skeptical of Padre Pio's claims, launched multiple investigations. Church officials were concerned that the stigmata might be fraudulent or the result of psychological suggestion. They subjected Padre Pio to extensive questioning and observation. In 1923, the Holy Office even restricted his public activities, fearing that the growing attention around his stigmata was creating unwanted sensationalism. But the restrictions only seemed to intensify interest in Padre Pio. Pilgrims from around the world began making their way to San Giovanni Rotondo to see the stigmatized priest. Many claimed to experience miraculous healings in his presence. Others reported supernatural phenomena during his masses. The scent of roses, which had followed Padre Pio since childhood, became so strongly associated with him that people claimed to smell it even when he was nowhere nearby. One of the most documented aspects of Padre Pio's ministry was his apparent ability to read souls during confession. Penitents would enter the confessional booth only to have Padre Pio describe sins they hadn't yet confessed. He would sometimes refuse absolution to people who hadn't been completely honest about their transgressions. In other cases, he would provide guidance about problems the person hadn't mentioned. Giovanni Siena, a businessman from Milan, described his first confession with Padre Pio in 1952. Siena had prepared a careful list of sins to confess, hoping to make a good impression. Before he could speak, Padre Pio interrupted him. The priest described in detail several serious sins that Siena had committed years earlier, but had been too ashamed to confess. He then provided specific guidance about problems in Siena's family life that no one outside his immediate family could have known about. Similar stories emerged from hundreds of other penitents. Padre Pio seemed to possess knowledge that went far beyond what any normal person could access. Skeptics suggested that he might have gathered information about his visitors through informants or careful observation. But many of his most accurate insights concerned people he was meeting for the first time, visitors from distant countries who had no connection to his local community. The phenomenon of bilocation, the ability to appear in two places simultaneously, became another hallmark of Padre Pio's ministry. Dozens of witnesses claimed to have seen or interacted with him in locations hundreds or thousands of miles from San Giovanni Rotondo, while other witnesses confirmed he was celebrating Mass or hearing confessions at the monastery. General Luigi Cadorna, commander of Italian forces during World War I, reported seeing Padre Pio appear in his military headquarters tent in 1917 to warn him of an impending attack. Cadorna later traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo and immediately recognized Padre Pio as the mysterious figure who had saved his army. At the time of the vision, Padre Pio had never left his monastery and had no possible way of knowing about military movements. Even more remarkably, several people claimed that Padre Pio had appeared to them during moments of crisis or danger, providing comfort or guidance when they needed it most. These apparitions were often accompanied by the characteristic scent of roses that surrounded the priest. In many cases, the people experiencing these visions had never heard of Padre Pio before their encounters with his apparent bilocation. The medical mystery of his stigmata deepened as the decades passed. In 1947, Dr. Raphael Festa, son of the original examining physician, conducted a new series of tests. He found that the wounds had not changed at all in nearly 30 years. They were the same size, the same depth, and showed the same complete absence of infection or normal healing processes. Dr. Festa attempted to determine the cause of the ongoing bleeding. He found that the wounds produced approximately 1 tablespoon of blood daily, despite showing no signs of active tissue damage. The blood itself was normal in all respects, but its source remained mysterious. The wounds appeared to be sealed rather than actively bleeding, yet blood continued to seep through the sealed tissue. In 1954, Dr. Giulio Cardone conducted what may have been the most thorough medical examination of Padre Pio's stigmata. Using advanced diagnostic techniques available at the time, he created detailed documentation of the wound's structure and behavior. His findings, published in medical journals, concluded that the stigmata represented a phenomenon that fell outside current medical understanding. Dr. Cardone noted several particularly puzzling aspects of the wounds. The tissue around each opening showed signs of what he termed supernatural preservation. Normal human tissue exposed to constant moisture and contact with air should have shown signs of breakdown, scarring, or abnormal growth. Padre Pio's stigmata showed none of these normal responses. The flesh appeared to be maintained in a state that defied biological processes. Perhaps even more mysteriously, the wounds seemed to respond to Padre Pio's spiritual state. Witnesses noted that the bleeding would increase during times of intense prayer or religious devotion. During his daily celebration of Mass, the wounds would often bleed more heavily, particularly during the consecration when Catholic doctrine holds that bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. The wounds also seemed to be sensitive to the liturgical calendar. During Holy Week, the period leading up to Easter when Christians commemorate Christ's crucifixion, Padre Pio's stigmata would become more pronounced. The bleeding would increase, and witnesses reported that he seemed to experience greater physical pain. On Good Friday, the day Christians observe Christ's death, Padre Pio would often be found in apparent agony, as if experiencing the crucifixion himself. Yet for all the pain the stigmata seemed to cause, Padre Pio rarely complained about his condition. He referred to his wounds as his participation in Christ's passion, a spiritual gift that allowed him to share in the suffering that Christians believe redeemed humanity. He saw the stigmata not as a burden but as a calling, a visible sign of his connection to the divine. The Catholic Church's official investigation of Padre Pio continued for decades. Church officials interviewed hundreds of witnesses, examined medical records, and subjected every aspect of his life to intense scrutiny. They were particularly concerned about ruling out fraud or self-infliction of the wounds. The investigation included psychological evaluations, medical examinations by church-approved physicians, and constant observation by fellow monks. Despite this intensive scrutiny, investigators found no evidence of deception. The wounds were genuine, inexplicable, and apparently permanent. In 1947, Pope Pius XII lifted the restrictions that had been placed on Padre Pio's ministry, effectively acknowledging that the Church had found no grounds for considering his stigmata fraudulent. The lifting of restrictions led to an explosion of interest in Padre Pio. Pilgrims began arriving in San Giovanni Rotondo by the thousands. The small monastery town was transformed into a major pilgrimage destination. Hotels, restaurants, and shops sprang up to serve the constant stream of visitors hopping to attend one of Padre Pio's masses or receive his blessing. Padre Pio's daily mass became legendary among Catholics. Witnesses described it as a mystical experience that seemed to transport everyone present into a different realm. The priest would often pause during the consecration, his eyes closed, tears streaming down his face, as if he were witnessing something invisible to others. The stigmata on his hands would bleed more heavily during these moments, sometimes soaking through the bandages he wore while celebrating Mass. Many pilgrims reported miraculous healings after attending Padre Pio's Mass or receiving his blessing. While the Catholic Church requires extensive documentation and verification before officially recognizing miracles, the anecdotal accounts of healings associated with Padre Pio numbered in the thousands. People claimed to be cured of cancer, blindness, paralysis, and other serious medical conditions after encounters with the stigmatized priest. Gemma di Giorgi, born blind in 1939, was one of the most documented cases. Her grandmother brought the infant to see Padre Pio when she was just a few weeks old. According to witnesses, Padre Pio blessed the child and said simply, "She will see." Medical examinations had confirmed that Gemma was born without pupils, making sight impossible. Yet within days of the blessing, her eyes began to develop normally, and she grew up with perfect vision. The medical establishment struggled to explain not only Padre Pio's stigmata, but also the healings apparently associated with his ministry. Some doctors suggested that the power of suggestion might account for certain improvements in conditions that had psychological components. But many of the reported healings involved organic diseases or physical deformities that would not typically respond to psychological factors. Dr. Festa, who had examined Padre Pio's stigmata for decades, also documented several cases of apparent miraculous healing. He noted that people with medically confirmed terminal illnesses would sometimes experience complete recovery after contact with Padre Pio. While he couldn't provide a scientific explanation for these occurrences, he felt compelled to document them as accurately as possible. As Padre Pio aged, observers began to wonder what would happen to his stigmata. The wounds had remained unchanged for 50 years. Would they persist after his death? Would they finally heal, or would they remain as permanent marks on his body? These questions took on greater urgency as Padre Pio's health began to decline in the 1960s. In September 1968, just days before his death, something unprecedented occurred. The stigmata that had marked Padre Pio's body for 50 years began to disappear. The wounds that had defied all medical explanation slowly closed. By the time of his death on September 23, 1968, his hands, feet, and side showed no trace of the wounds that had defined his ministry. Dr. Cesar Festa, who had succeeded his father as Padre Pio's physician, documented this final mystery. He noted that the wounds didn't heal in the normal sense. There was no scarring, no evidence that they had ever existed. The skin was smooth and unmarked, as if the stigmata had never appeared. It was as if whatever force had maintained the wounds for 5 decades had simply withdrawn, leaving behind no physical trace of their presence. The disappearance of the stigmata before Padre Pio's death added another layer of mystery to his story. Some interpreted it as a sign that his earthly mission was complete, that the wounds had served their spiritual purpose and were no longer needed. Others saw it as final proof that the stigmata had been supernatural in origin, since they vanished just as mysteriously as they had appeared. Padre Pio's funeral drew over 100,000 mourners to San Giovanni Rotondo. The Vatican, which had once viewed him with suspicion, sent high-ranking officials to represent the church at the ceremony. The man who had once been restricted in his ministry was now being honored as one of the most significant religious figures of the 20th century. The process of canonization, which could lead to Padre Pio being declared a saint, began almost immediately after his death. Church officials launched the most thorough investigation in Vatican history, examining every aspect of his life and ministry. They interviewed thousands of witnesses, reviewed medical records spanning 5 decades, and subjected every reported miracle to intensive scrutiny. The investigation faced significant challenges. How do you verify supernatural phenomena using scientific methods? How do you distinguish between genuine miracles and coincidental medical recoveries? The Church's standards for canonization require evidence that meets both theological and scientific criteria, a standard that few historical figures have ever satisfied. Despite these challenges, the evidence supporting Padre Pio's cause for sainthood was overwhelming. In 2002, Pope John Paul II canonized him as Saint Pio of Pietrelcina, formally recognizing him as a saint in the Catholic Church. The canonization ceremony drew over 300,000 pilgrims to Rome, one of the largest gatherings in Vatican history. But canonization didn't resolve the fundamental mysteries surrounding Padre Pio's life. The stigmata remains medically unexplained. The numerous accounts of bilocation, healing, and supernatural knowledge continue to challenge our understanding of what might be possible for human beings. Modern science, with all its advances since Padre Pio's death, still has no framework for explaining how wounds could appear spontaneously and remain open without healing or infection for 50 years. Some researchers have suggested that the stigmata might be a form of psychosomatic phenomenon, where intense religious belief creates physical manifestations in the body. The field of psychoneuroimmunology has shown that mental states can indeed influence physical health in ways we're only beginning to understand. Perhaps Padre Pio's deep identification with Christ's suffering somehow triggered biological processes that created and maintained the wounds. Yet this explanation faces significant challenges. Psychosomatic conditions typically fluctuate based on the person's mental state and stress levels. They rarely maintain exact consistency for decades. Moreover, the precision of Padre Pio's wounds, their perfect symmetry and anatomical accuracy, suggests a level of unconscious control over biological processes that goes far beyond anything documented in medical literature. Other researchers have explored the possibility that the stigmata might be related to unusual neurological conditions. Some forms of epilepsy or other brain disorders can cause unusual physical sensations and even apparent wounds. But again, the consistency and longevity of Padre Pio's stigmata don't match typical patterns of neurological conditions. The mystery deepens when we consider that Padre Pio's stigmata appeared in an era before the detailed anatomical knowledge that would be needed to fake such wounds convincingly. In 1918, when the wounds first appeared, the average person's knowledge of crucifixion wounds would have been based on artistic representations, which were often anatomically inaccurate. Yet Padre Pio's wounds matched what modern forensic analysis suggests actual crucifixion wounds would have looked like. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided new insights into Roman crucifixion practices. Evidence suggests that nails were typically driven through the wrists rather than the palms, since the palm wouldn't support the weight of a crucified person. Yet Padre Pio's wounds appeared in his palms, matching traditional artistic depictions rather than historical accuracy. This detail has led some skeptics to suggest that the wounds might have been influenced by religious art rather than divine intervention. However, defenders of Padre Pio's authenticity point out that if the stigmata were meant to be a spiritual sign rather than a historical recreation, it would make sense for them to appear in locations that would be recognized and understood by believers, even if those locations weren't historically accurate. The question of authenticity becomes even more complex when we consider the broader phenomenon of stigmata throughout history. The Catholic Church has documented over 300 cases of stigmata since St. Francis of Assisi became the first recorded stigmatic in 1224. The vast majority of these cases have been in women, typically nuns or other women with intense religious devotion. Padre Pio was unusual not only for the longevity of his stigmata, but also for being male. Most stigmatics have experienced their wounds for brief periods, often during times of intense religious fervor or spiritual crisis. The wounds typically appear and disappear within weeks or months. A few cases have lasted for years, but none approached the 50-year duration of Padre Pio's stigmata. This longevity sets his case apart from virtually all other documented instances of the phenomenon. Modern technology has provided new tools for investigating stigmata cases that occur today. Thermographic imaging can detect temperature variations that might indicate self-inflicted wounds. Video monitoring can document the appearance and behavior of wounds over time. DNA analysis can determine if blood found on stigmatics actually belongs to them. Yet even with these advanced techniques, recent cases of stigmata remain as puzzling as historical ones. The story of Padre Pio raises profound questions about the nature of reality and the limits of human experience. If his stigmata was genuine, it suggests that consciousness and belief can influence physical reality in ways that modern science doesn't understand. If it was somehow fraudulent or self-induced, it represents an extraordinary case of sustained deception that fooled hundreds of physicians and thousands of witnesses over 5 decades. Perhaps more intriguingly, Padre Pio's story asks us to consider what we mean by authentic religious experience. Even if the stigmata could be explained by some unknown psychological or neurological process, would that make it any less meaningful to the millions of people who found spiritual inspiration in his life? Does a phenomenon need to be supernatural to be significant, or can deep human experiences carry profound meaning regardless of their ultimate cause? The mystery of Padre Pio's stigmata remains unsolved more than 50 years after his death. Medical science has advanced dramatically since his lifetime, giving us new insights into how the mind can influence the body, how belief can affect healing, and how unusual neurological conditions can create apparently impossible physical phenomena. Yet none of these advances have provided a satisfying explanation for the wounds that marked his hands, feet, and side for half a century. What we're left with is a story that challenges our assumptions about what's possible in human experience. Whether we interpret Padre Pio's life through the lens of faith or science, his stigmata represents a mystery that continues to inspire, puzzle, and provoke questions about the deepest aspects of human existence. Every year on the Saturday before Orthodox Easter, something extraordinary happens in one of Christianity's holiest sites. Inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, thousands of pilgrims crowd together in darkness, waiting for a miracle that has allegedly occurred for over 1,500 years. They're waiting for the holy fire, a flame that believers say ignites spontaneously inside the tomb where Jesus Christ was buried and risen. But this isn't just any fire. According to witnesses, the holy fire behaves unlike normal flames. It doesn't burn skin or clothing when first ignited. It dances and moves in ways that seem to defy physics. It appears without any visible source of ignition, emerging from what should be an empty stone chamber. And it happens on schedule year after year, witnessed by thousands of people and documented by cameras, scientists, and skeptics alike. The Holy Fire ceremony represents one of the most public and regularly occurring alleged miracles in the modern world. Unlike many religious phenomena that occur in private or in remote locations, the Holy Fire happens in full view of massive crowds, in a location that's been continuously monitored and studied for centuries. Yet despite all this observation and documentation, the mechanism behind the Holy Fire remains as mysterious today as it was when the ceremony first began. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre sits in the heart of Jerusalem's Old City, built over what Christian tradition holds to be the site of Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. The current church structure dates back to the 12th century, though churches have stood on this site since the 4th century. The building encompasses several sacred locations, but the most important is the edicule, a small stone chamber that houses what believers consider to be Christ's tomb. The edicule is a modest structure, just large enough for a few people to enter at once. Inside, there's a marble slab covering what tradition holds to be the actual burial place of Jesus. This chamber becomes the focal point of one of Christianity's most mysterious annual events. On the Saturday afternoon before Orthodox Easter, known as Holy Saturday, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem enters the edicule alone to pray and wait for the holy fire to appear. The ceremony begins hours before the Patriarch enters the tomb. Pilgrims from around the world, primarily from Orthodox Christian countries like Greece, Russia, Serbia, and Romania, begin gathering inside the church before dawn. By afternoon, the ancient building is packed with thousands of people, all holding unlit candles and waiting for the moment when the holy fire will allegedly appear. The atmosphere inside the church during these hours is unlike anything else in the religious world. The crowd sings traditional hymns, some dating back over 1,000 years. The air fills with incense from countless thuribles swinging throughout the congregation. Pilgrims press against barriers, trying to get as close as possible to the edicule. The energy is electric, a mixture of devotion, anticipation, and something that witnesses struggle to describe in ordinary terms. What makes this gathering even more remarkable is its diversity. While the ceremony is conducted by the Greek Orthodox Church, pilgrims come from dozens of different Christian denominations. Catholics, Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and members of various ancient Christian communities all participate together in this annual vigil. Religious differences that might divide these groups in other contexts seem to dissolve in the shared anticipation of witnessing something miraculous. As the appointed time approaches, usually around 2 in the afternoon, the Patriarch of Jerusalem approaches the edicule. He's accompanied by an Armenian Orthodox priest, reflecting an ancient agreement between the two churches about custody of the holy sites. Before entering the tomb, the Patriarch removes his ceremonial vestments, stripping down to a simple white robe to demonstrate that he carries nothing that could be used to create fire artificially. Church officials and representatives from various Christian communities carefully inspect the Patriarch before he enters the tomb. They examine his clothing, search for any hidden devices, and sometimes even use metal detectors to ensure he carries nothing that could produce flame. These inspections are conducted openly, in full view of the assembled crowd, as a way of demonstrating the authenticity of what's about to occur. The edicule itself is also inspected before the ceremony. Church officials, often accompanied by representatives from the Israeli authorities who maintain security at the site, examine the interior of the tomb chamber. They look for any hidden devices, chemical substances, or mechanisms that might be used to create fire artificially. The stone surfaces are cleaned and examined. Every possible hiding place is searched. These precautions reflect the serious nature of the claims surrounding the holy fire. Church officials are well aware that skeptics around the world scrutinize this ceremony, looking for evidence of fraud or trickery. The inspections are designed to eliminate any reasonable possibility that the fire could be created through human means, at least using conventional methods that could be easily concealed and deployed. Once the inspections are complete, the patriarch enters the edicule alone. The heavy door is sealed behind him, and the waiting begins. Inside the tomb, according to the patriarch's own accounts, he removes even his simple white robe and kneels naked on the stone floor. He prays intensely, often for many minutes, calling upon God to send the holy fire as a sign of Christ's continuing presence in the world. What happens next, according to the testimonies of dozens of patriarchs over the centuries, defies normal explanation. The patriarch reports that the tomb chamber begins to fill with a strange light, not like any ordinary illumination. This light doesn't come from any visible source. It seems to emanate from the walls themselves, or perhaps from the air. The light grows brighter and more intense, until it suddenly coalesces into actual flames that appear on the marble slab covering the burial site. The flames, according to the patriarch's accounts, don't appear gradually as normal fires do. They don't start as sparks that grow into flames. Instead, they seem to materialize fully formed, dancing and moving across the marble surface in patterns that seem almost alive. The fire appears blue or white rather than the yellow-orange color of normal flames, and it moves in ways that seem to defy the normal behavior of fire. Most remarkably, the patriarch reports that these flames don't burn him, even when he reaches out to touch them. He can pass his hands through the fire without feeling heat or experiencing any pain. His hair and skin remain unburned even when brought into direct contact with the flames. This cool burning property allegedly continues for the first few minutes after the fire appears, gradually transitioning to normal burning behavior as time passes. Using bundles of candles he brings into the tomb, the patriarch lights them from the holy fire. The moment he has successfully lit the candles, he signals to those waiting outside by pounding on the sealed door. Church officials immediately open the edicule, and the patriarch emerges holding the burning candles. The crowd erupts in celebration as the holy fire spreads throughout the church. What happens next is one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire ceremony. The patriarch's lit candles are used to light other candles, which in turn light still others, in a chain reaction that spreads throughout the entire church within minutes. Thousands of people hold their candles aloft as the holy fire passes from person to person. The ancient building fills with flickering light as normal electric lighting is turned off, and the entire ceremony is illuminated only by candlelight. But according to witnesses, the fire that spreads throughout the church retains the unusual properties of the original holy fire, at least for the first several minutes after it appears. Pilgrims report being able to pass their hands through the flames without being burned. Some wave the flames directly across their faces or hold burning candles against their skin without experiencing pain or injury. Videos and photographs from the ceremony show people engaging in behavior with fire that would normally result in severe burns. This cool burning property of the holy fire has been documented by numerous witnesses over the centuries. Medieval pilgrims wrote detailed accounts of being able to bathe their faces in the flame without harm. Modern pilgrims continue to report the same phenomenon, often expressing amazement at being able to interact with fire in ways that should be impossible. Dr. Eugene Mornian, a French physician who attended the ceremony in 1967, provided one of the most detailed medical observations of the holy fire's behavior. He documented that people were indeed holding flames directly against their skin without experiencing burns. He timed the cool burning period and found that it lasted approximately 15 minutes after the fire first appeared. After that time, the flames began to burn normally, and people had to handle them with the usual caution. The cool burning property isn't universal or permanent. Some people report being burned by the fire even in the first minutes after it appears. The flames gradually transition to normal burning behavior, and by the end of the ceremony, they require the same careful handling as any other fire. But for those crucial first minutes, many witnesses report fire that behaves unlike anything they've ever encountered. Scientific attempts to study the holy fire have faced numerous challenges. The ceremony takes place in a crowded, controlled environment where extensive measurement equipment would be impractical. The Greek Orthodox Church, which controls access to the ceremony, has been selective about allowing scientific investigation, preferring to maintain the religious nature of the event rather than subjecting it to extensive analysis. However, some limited scientific observation has occurred over the years. In 1995, a team led by Dr. Andrei Volkov, a Russian physicist, was granted permission to conduct measurements during the ceremony. Using spectral analysis equipment, they examined the light emitted by the holy fire and found that it produced a spectrum unlike normal fire. The measurements suggested that the fire was burning at a much lower temperature than typical flames, which might explain why it doesn't immediately burn human skin. Dr. Volkov's team also used infrared cameras to monitor the temperature inside the edicule before and during the ceremony. They found that the temperature inside the tomb did not increase significantly when the fire appeared, as would be expected with normal combustion. Instead, the interior temperature remained relatively stable, suggesting that the fire was not producing heat in the normal way. These findings, while intriguing, have not been independently replicated or verified by other scientific teams. The Greek Orthodox Church has generally been resistant to extensive scientific study, arguing that approaching the holy fire as a scientific phenomenon rather than a religious mystery misses its essential spiritual meaning. They point out that the fire has appeared reliably for over 15 centuries, and that attempts to explain it scientifically might actually undermine the faith that makes it meaningful to millions of believers. The historical documentation of the holy fire ceremony extends back over a millennium. The earliest detailed account comes from Bernard the Wise, a Frankish monk who witnessed the ceremony in 867 CE. His description matches many elements of the modern ceremony, including the patriarch entering the tomb alone, the spontaneous appearance of fire, and its unusual burning properties. During the Crusades, Western European knights and pilgrims provided numerous accounts of the holy fire ceremony. These writings, preserved in monasteries and libraries across Europe, describe essentially the same phenomenon that modern pilgrims witness today. The fire appears without visible cause, burns cool initially, and spreads throughout the church in a wave of celebration. What makes these historical accounts particularly significant is their consistency across cultures and centuries. Pilgrims from different countries, different Christian denominations, and different historical periods have described virtually identical phenomena. This consistency is remarkable given that these witnesses had no opportunity to coordinate their stories and often came from regions with limited communication with each other. The ceremony has continued even during some of the darkest periods in Jerusalem's history. During the Ottoman occupation of Jerusalem, Muslim authorities initially viewed the ceremony with suspicion, but eventually came to see it as a significant source of pilgrimage revenue. Ottoman records from the 16th and 17th centuries document the holy fire ceremony and note that it attracted thousands of Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem each year. During the British Mandate period in the 20th century, British authorities conducted their own investigations into the ceremony. Colonial administrators, trained to be skeptical of local customs and religious claims, nonetheless documented that something unusual occurred during the holy fire ceremony. Their reports note that extensive searches of the patriarch and the tomb chamber failed to reveal any mechanism by which fire could be produced artificially. The establishment of Israel in 1948 created new challenges and opportunities for studying the holy fire. Israeli authorities, responsible for maintaining order and security at one of the world's most sensitive religious sites, have had to balance respect for religious practice with their duty to ensure public safety. They've implemented extensive security measures around the ceremony, including detailed searches and the presence of fire safety equipment. Israeli fire safety experts have examined the ceremony from a practical standpoint, focusing on the challenge of managing thousands of people with lit candles in an ancient building. They've noted that the holy fire, whatever its origin, does behave differently from normal fire during the first minutes of the ceremony. Fire safety protocols that would normally be required for such large crowds with open flames are modified during this initial period, because the fire genuinely appears to pose less risk of burns or accidental ignition. Modern technology has provided new ways to document the holy fire ceremony. High-definition cameras, infrared imaging, and other recording equipment have captured the ceremony in unprecedented detail. These recordings show the fire appearing inside the edicule without any visible ignition source. They document people interacting with the flames in ways that would normally cause severe burns. They provide a visual record that confirms many of the phenomena that witnesses have described for centuries. However, video documentation has also intensified debates about the ceremony's authenticity. Skeptics point to brief moments in some recordings where the fire's behavior appears consistent with normal combustion. They suggest that the unusual properties of the holy fire might be exaggerated by the excitement and religious fervor of the ceremony. Believers counter that no video recording can capture the full sensory experience of being present during the ceremony, and that the spiritual dimensions of the event can't be reduced to what cameras can document. The question of fraud has been raised repeatedly throughout the centuries. Critics have suggested various ways that the fire might be produced artificially, using everything from chemicals that ignite spontaneously when exposed to air, to hidden electrical devices, to prearranged signals that allow accomplices to introduce fire into the tomb through secret passages. However, each of these theories faces significant practical challenges. The edicule has been thoroughly examined by multiple parties over the centuries, including hostile investigators who would have been motivated to expose any deception. No hidden mechanisms, secret passages, or chemical devices have ever been discovered despite intensive searches. The chemical theory, while superficially plausible, faces several problems. Substances that ignite spontaneously in air, such as white phosphorus, are highly dangerous and difficult to control. They would likely cause severe burns to anyone handling them, contradicting the accounts of the patriarch emerging unharmed from the tomb. Moreover, such chemicals would leave distinctive odors and residues that would be easily detected by the crowds present during the ceremony. The electrical ignition theory requires a power source and wiring that would have to be concealed within the ancient stone structure of the edicule. Given that the tomb has been renovated and examined multiple times over the centuries, including major restoration work completed in 2016, any such devices would almost certainly have been discovered. Additionally, electrical sparks would create a very different visual appearance from the dancing flames that witnesses describe. Perhaps most challenging for fraud theories is the consistency of the phenomenon across different patriarchs. The ceremony has been conducted by dozens of different Greek Orthodox patriarchs over the centuries, each serving for years or decades. For fraud to explain the holy fire, it would require a conspiracy involving every patriarch, transmitted from one to the next over 15 centuries, without any of them ever revealing the secret or making an error that exposed the deception. The cool burning properties of the fire present another challenge to fraud theories. While certain chemical compounds can burn at lower temperatures, creating flames that are less likely to cause immediate burns, none known to science can create fire that completely fails to burn human skin for extended contact. The accounts of people bathing their faces in the flames or holding burning candles against their skin would require fire that burns far cooler than any normal combustion process can produce. Dr. Mornian's 1967 observations included attempts to measure the temperature of the holy fire using instruments concealed among his personal belongings. His readings suggested that the flames were burning at temperatures significantly below what would be expected for normal fire, though the Greek Orthodox authorities prevented him from conducting more extensive measurements. While these readings were limited and haven't been independently verified, they provide some scientific support for the witness accounts of unusually cool fire. The behavioral properties of the holy fire have been particularly difficult to explain through conventional means. Witnesses consistently describe fire that moves in coordinated patterns, almost as if it has intelligence or purpose. Normal fire burns chaotically, following the distribution of fuel and air currents. The holy fire allegedly moves in ways that seem deliberate, dancing across surfaces in patterns that observers describe as beautiful and meaningful. Some investigators have suggested that these observations might be influenced by the religious excitement and group psychology of the ceremony. In highly charged emotional situations, people sometimes perceive patterns and meaning in random events. The expectation of witnessing a miracle might cause pilgrims to interpret normal fire behavior as supernatural. However, this explanation struggles to account for the consistency of reports across different cultures, time periods, and even from skeptical observers who attended the ceremony with the intention of debunking it. The timing of the holy fire's appearance presents another puzzle for skeptics. The fire appears at different times each year, corresponding to the Orthodox calculation of Easter, which follows different rules from the Western Christian calendar. The ceremony doesn't occur at a fixed date, but follows the complex Orthodox formula for determining Easter Sunday. If the fire were produced artificially, it would require human intervention that could presumably occur at any time. The fact that it consistently appears during the specific religious observance suggests either remarkable discipline on the part of any hypothetical fraudsters or a genuine connection to the religious calendar. Moreover, the fire has reportedly failed to appear on a few occasions throughout history, each time corresponding to periods when the Orthodox Church was experiencing internal conflict or when external authorities attempted to interfere with the ceremony. In 1034 CE, according to historical records, the fire failed to appear during a year when the Byzantine emperor had appointed a new patriarch against the wishes of the local Orthodox community. The fire allegedly appeared the following year, when the legitimate patriarch was restored to his position. These failures, if accurate, suggest that the phenomenon responds to spiritual or political conditions rather than being produced mechanically. A fraudulent ceremony would presumably continue regardless of church politics, since the techniques for producing artificial fire would remain available regardless of who was conducting the ceremony. The reported failures provide evidence that whatever causes the holy fire is sensitive to factors beyond simple human control. Recent decades have brought new challenges to the holy fire ceremony. The growth of global media coverage means that the event is now witnessed by millions of people worldwide through television and internet broadcasts. This expanded audience includes many skeptics and scientists who analyze the ceremony frame by frame, looking for evidence of deception. The increased scrutiny has intensified debates about the phenomenon's authenticity without providing definitive answers. Social media has created new dynamics around the ceremony. Pilgrims now share their experiences instantly with global audiences, providing countless personal testimonies about the holy fire's unusual properties. While these accounts are necessarily subjective and unscientific, Their volume and consistency provide a form of crowdsourced documentation that didn't exist in earlier centuries. Thousands of people each year report first-hand experiences with fire that behaves unlike anything they've encountered before. The Israeli government's role in managing the ceremony has added another layer of oversight to the process. Israeli security forces, fire safety officials, and other authorities have no religious stake in the ceremony's authenticity, making them relatively objective observers. Their reports consistently note that something unusual occurs during the ceremony, though they avoid taking official positions on whether the phenomenon is miraculous or natural. Fire safety protocols implemented by Israeli authorities provide another perspective on the holy fire's properties. During normal religious ceremonies involving candles, extensive precautions are required to prevent accidental fires and burns. During the holy fire ceremony, these protocols are modified for the first 15 to 20 minutes after the fire appears, reflecting the practical observation that the fire behaves less dangerously during this period. While authorities don't officially endorse the miraculous nature of the fire, their modified safety procedures implicitly acknowledge its unusual properties. The economic impact of the holy fire ceremony on Jerusalem provides another angle for understanding its significance. The annual event brings thousands of pilgrims to Jerusalem, generating substantial tourism revenue for the city. Hotels, restaurants, tour guides, and numerous other businesses depend on the ceremony for a significant portion of their annual income. This economic dimension means that many people have financial incentives to maintain the ceremony's reputation, regardless of their personal beliefs about its authenticity. However, the economic argument cuts both ways. If the ceremony were fraudulent, exposing the fraud would presumably damage Jerusalem's tourism industry, giving local authorities incentives to investigate thoroughly and ensure that visitors aren't being deceived. The fact that Israeli authorities continue to facilitate the ceremony, despite having no religious obligation to do so, suggests that their investigations have not uncovered evidence of deliberate fraud. The theological implications of the holy fire ceremony extend far beyond questions of its physical mechanism. For Orthodox Christians, the ceremony represents an annual confirmation of Christ's continuing presence in the world. The fire symbolizes the light of resurrection, the triumph over death that forms the core of Christian belief. Whether the fire appears through miraculous intervention or natural processes that science doesn't yet understand may be less important than its spiritual meaning for believers. This theological perspective raises interesting questions about the nature of miracles and their relationship to natural law. If the holy fire were eventually explained through scientific investigation, would that diminish its religious significance? Some theologians argue that God could work through natural processes just as easily as through supernatural intervention, meaning that a scientific explanation wouldn't necessarily contradict belief in divine involvement. Others maintain that true miracles must involve suspension or transcendence of natural law, and that any phenomenon explicable through science, no matter how unusual, cannot be considered genuinely miraculous. This debate reflects broader theological discussions about the relationship between faith and reason, between religious experience and scientific knowledge. The interfaith dimensions of the holy fire ceremony add complexity to these theological questions. While the ceremony is conducted by the Orthodox Church, pilgrims from various Christian denominations participate in the event. Catholics, Protestants, and members of Eastern churches all report experiencing the unusual properties of the holy fire. This cross-denominational participation suggests that whatever causes the phenomenon transcends specific theological doctrines or ecclesiastical boundaries. Even more remarkably, some non-Christian observers have reported witnessing the unusual properties of the holy fire. Jewish residents of Jerusalem, Muslim visitors, and secular tourists have sometimes described seeing fire that behaves unlike normal flames. These accounts from people outside the Christian faith tradition provide additional perspective on the phenomenon, since these observers lack the religious framework that might predispose Christians to interpret unusual events as miraculous. The psychological dimensions of the holy fire ceremony deserve consideration, alongside its physical and theological aspects. The gathering of thousands of people in an ancient, sacred space creates an environment unlike anything most participants have ever experienced. The combination of religious devotion, historical significance, and collective anticipation might influence how people perceive and remember events during the ceremony. Research in crowd psychology has shown that large groups of people sharing intense emotional experiences can influence each other's perceptions in powerful ways. The expectation of witnessing a miracle, combined with the heightened emotional state created by the ceremony, might cause participants to interpret ambiguous sensory experiences as clearly supernatural. The dim lighting conditions inside the church during parts of the ceremony could make it difficult to assess the fire's behavior with complete accuracy. However, psychological explanations face their own limitations. The consistency of reports across different cultural groups, time periods, and individual psychological profiles suggests that the phenomenon can't be reduced to simple suggestion or crowd psychology. Moreover, many witnesses report that their experience of the holy fire's unusual properties was so clear and unambiguous that psychological factors seem inadequate to explain what they observed. The role of expectation in shaping religious experience is well documented, but the holy fire ceremony includes many participants who arrive as skeptics or casual observers rather than devoted believers. Tour guides, journalists, security personnel, and curious tourists often find themselves unexpectedly witnessing phenomena they can't easily explain. These unexpected encounters provide a different category of testimony from that of devoted pilgrims who arrive already believing they will witness a miracle. Modern neuroscience has provided new insights into how the brain processes unusual or contradictory sensory information. When people encounter phenomena that don't match their existing mental models of how the world works, the brain sometimes resolves the contradiction by reinterpreting the sensory data to fit familiar patterns. This process might explain why some people report seeing supernatural behavior in what might actually be unusual but natural phenomena. Yet neuroscientific explanations also have limitations. The holy fire ceremony involves multiple senses and extends over a significant period of time, making it difficult to dismiss all observations as neural misinterpretation. Moreover, physical evidence such as the absence of burns on people who interact closely with the fire provides objective confirmation that something unusual is indeed occurring, regardless of how individual brains interpret the experience. The question of documentation presents ongoing challenges for understanding the holy fire. While modern technology has provided unprecedented ability to record and analyze the ceremony, no amount of external documentation can fully capture the subjective experience of the participants. The most sophisticated cameras and instruments might miss subtle aspects of the phenomenon that are obvious to people present in the moment. Conversely, eyewitness testimony, no matter how sincere and detailed, is subject to the limitations of human perception and memory. People sometimes remember events differently from how they actually occurred, especially when those events are emotionally significant or contradict their normal understanding of reality. The most honest and careful observers might still provide inaccurate accounts of unusual phenomena. This documentation challenge reflects broader questions about how we understand and validate unusual claims. The scientific method relies on reproducible experiments conducted under controlled conditions, but religious phenomena often occur in contexts that resist scientific control. The holy fire ceremony happens once per year in a specific location under circumstances that can't be replicated in laboratory settings. How do we apply scientific standards to events that are inherently unique and unrepeatable? Some researchers have suggested that the holy fire represents a natural phenomenon that science doesn't yet understand rather than a supernatural miracle. The history of science includes numerous examples of phenomena that seemed miraculous until their natural mechanisms were discovered. Lightning, eclipses, and diseases all seemed supernatural before scientific explanations became available. This natural explanation approach suggests that the holy fire might involve unusual atmospheric conditions, electromagnetic phenomena, or chemical processes that occur specifically in the unique environment of the edicule. The combination of the chamber's stone composition, its enclosed atmosphere, the presence of large crowds, and the specific timing of the ceremony might create conditions that allow for unusual combustion behavior. However, natural explanations face the challenge of accounting for all aspects of the phenomenon, not just the appearance of fire. The cool burning properties, the coordinated movement patterns, the timing correlation with religious calendars, and the historical consistency across centuries all require explanation within any natural framework. No currently known natural processes account for all these characteristics occurring together reliably over such an extended period. The Holy Fire ceremony continues to occur each year, drawing thousands of pilgrims and maintaining its status as one of the most public and regularly witnessed alleged miracles in the modern world. Whether understood as supernatural intervention, unknown natural phenomena, or complex psychological and social processes, the ceremony represents something remarkable in human experience. For those who witness it, the holy fire often becomes a defining spiritual experience that shapes their understanding of faith, reality, and the possibility of the miraculous in the modern world. For skeptics and scientists, it presents an ongoing puzzle that challenges our understanding of combustion, crowd psychology, and the boundaries between natural and supernatural explanations. Perhaps most significantly, the Holy Fire ceremony demonstrates the persistence of mystery in an age that often assumes science has explained or will eventually explain everything. Here is a phenomenon that occurs regularly, in public, under extensive observation, yet remains as puzzling today as it was 15 centuries ago. In a world increasingly dominated by technology and scientific rationalism, the Holy Fire serves as an annual reminder that some aspects of human experience continue to defy easy categorization or explanation. The mystery endures, year after year, flame after flame, in the ancient stones of Jerusalem where faith and reason continue their eternal dance around questions that may be more important for their asking than for any answers we might eventually find. Deep within the Vatican archives, hidden among countless documents and testimonies, lies one of the most extraordinary and well-documented cases of human levitation in recorded history. This isn't a tale whispered in dark corners or passed down through folklore. This is the officially recognized story of Giuseppe de Sa, better known as Saint Joseph of Cupertino, a man whose ability to defy gravity was witnessed by hundreds of people, including cardinals, princes, and even skeptical scientists. What makes Joseph's story so compelling isn't just that he could allegedly fly. It's that his levitations were so frequent, so public, and so thoroughly documented that the Catholic Church itself couldn't ignore them. In fact, they were so concerned about the spectacle he was causing that they eventually banned him from public masses. But the question that haunts us today is simple yet profound. How did a simple Italian friar manage to float through the air as if gravity had simply forgotten he existed? Giuseppe de Sa was born in 1603 in the small town of Cupertino, in what is now southern Italy. From the very beginning, his life was marked by strangeness. As a child, he was known for falling into mysterious trances, standing motionless for hours as if transported to another realm entirely. His mouth would hang open during these episodes, earning him the nickname Bocca Aperta, which means open mouth in Italian. His family and neighbors didn't know what to make of these episodes. Some thought he was simple-minded. Others whispered that something supernatural was at work. As Giuseppe grew older, these trances became more intense and more frequent. But it wasn't until he joined the Franciscan order and became a friar that the truly impossible began to happen. During prayer, during Mass, sometimes even during casual conversation, Giuseppe would suddenly cry out and rise into the air, floating several feet above the ground for minutes at a time. These weren't brief hops or tricks of the light. According to witness accounts, he would levitate for extended periods, sometimes flying across rooms to embrace statues or images of religious figures. The first recorded instance of his levitation occurred during his ordination as a priest in 1628. According to the official church records, Giuseppe suddenly rose from the altar steps and floated through the air to the high altar, where he embraced the tabernacle before gently floating back down. The congregation watched in stunned silence. Word of this miracle spread quickly, and soon people were traveling from across Europe just to witness the flying friar for themselves. But what truly sets Joseph's case apart from other claimed miracles is the sheer number of witnesses. Over the course of his life, more than 100 separate levitation events were officially recorded by the Catholic Church. These weren't private mystical experiences witnessed by a handful of believers. They were public spectacles observed by hundreds of people, including some of the most powerful and skeptical minds of the 17th century. Among the witnesses were Cardinal Lambertini, who would later become Pope Benedict XIV. The cardinal was initially skeptical of the reports and came to observe Joseph personally. According to his written testimony, he watched in amazement as Joseph levitated during prayer, floating several feet above the altar for nearly 15 minutes. The cardinal's detailed account of this event still exists in the Vatican archives today, written in his own hand and sealed with his official seal. Another notable witness was Admiral Giovanni Francisco Morosini, a Venetian nobleman and military leader known for his rational, scientific approach to life. Morosini had heard the stories about the flying friar and decided to investigate personally, convinced he would expose what he believed to be an elaborate hoax. Instead, he found himself witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the physical world. In his written account, Morosini describes watching Joseph during evening prayers. The friar was kneeling before a statue of the Virgin Mary when he suddenly let out a cry and rose into the air. According to Morosini, Joseph floated across the chapel, embraced the statue, and remained suspended in the air for several minutes while apparently in a state of religious ecstasy. The admiral wrote that he examined the area afterward, looking for hidden wires or mechanical devices that could explain what he had seen, but found nothing. Perhaps even more remarkable was the testimony of Duke John Frederick of Brunswick, a Lutheran prince who was considering converting to Catholicism. The Duke had requested a private audience with Joseph, hoping to discuss matters of faith. According to the official church record of this meeting, their conversation was interrupted when Joseph suddenly levitated during a prayer, rising to eye level with a statue of the Immaculate Conception that hung high on the chapel wall. The Duke was so shaken by what he witnessed that he converted to Catholicism on the spot. In his letter to his family, he wrote that what he had seen defied all natural explanation and convinced him of the truth of the Catholic faith. This conversion was significant enough that it was noted by political observers across Europe, as the Duke's religious affiliation had important diplomatic implications. But Joseph's levitations weren't limited to religious settings. Sometimes they occurred during seemingly mundane activities. There are accounts of him floating while eating, while walking in the garden, even while having casual conversations with other friars. One particularly detailed account describes an incident where Joseph was helping to construct a Calvary shrine for the monastery. A heavy wooden cross, requiring 10 men to lift, needed to be placed at the top of the structure. According to the witnesses, Joseph approached the cross, let out his characteristic cry, and suddenly rose into the air, carrying the massive cross with him as if it weighed nothing. He floated to the top of the shrine, positioned the cross perfectly, and then gently descended back to the ground. The other workers, who had been struggling to figure out how to lift the cross into position, stood watching in amazement. These accounts might seem impossible to modern minds, but what makes them particularly intriguing is the consistency of the details across hundreds of independent witness testimonies. The descriptions of Joseph's levitations follow a remarkably similar pattern. Witnesses consistently reported that the episodes began with Joseph letting out a distinctive cry or exclamation. His face would take on an expression of intense spiritual joy. His eyes would roll back, and he would appear to enter a trance-like state. During these episodes, witnesses reported that Joseph seemed completely unaware of his surroundings. He couldn't be roused by voices or touch, and he appeared to be in a state of religious ecstasy. The levitations themselves were described as gentle and graceful, not violent or chaotic. Joseph would rise smoothly into the air, sometimes remaining stationary, other times floating across rooms or even outdoors. What's particularly striking about these accounts is how they describe the end of each episode. Joseph wouldn't simply fall back to the ground. Instead, witnesses consistently reported that he would descend gently, as if being lowered by invisible hands. Upon touching the ground, he would immediately return to normal consciousness, often appearing surprised or disoriented, as if he had no memory of what had just occurred. The Catholic Church's response to Joseph's levitations was complex and reveals much about how even religious authorities struggled to understand and control such phenomena. Initially, church officials were skeptical. Claims of miraculous abilities were not uncommon, and the church had developed rigorous procedures for investigating such reports. They assigned teams of theologians and investigators to observe Joseph and document his activities. But as the evidence mounted and the witnesses multiplied, skepticism gave way to concern. Joseph's levitations were drawing massive crowds, sometimes disrupting entire towns as pilgrims flocked to witness the flying friar. Church authorities worried that the spectacle was becoming a distraction from proper religious devotion. There were also concerns that Joseph's abilities might be misinterpreted or exploited by those seeking to create their own cult followings. In 1639, just 11 years after Joseph's ordination, the Inquisition ordered him to Naples for investigation. This was not necessarily an accusation of heresy, but rather a standard procedure for examining unusual religious phenomena. The investigators spent months observing Joseph, interviewing witnesses, and examining the locations where his levitations occurred. Remarkably, instead of declaring his abilities to be fraudulent or demonic, the Inquisition concluded that Joseph's levitations were genuine miraculous gifts from God. However, they also decided that these gifts were too disruptive to public order. Joseph was banned from celebrating public masses and was essentially placed under house arrest in various remote monasteries for the remainder of his life. This decision by the Inquisition is particularly significant because it represents one of the few times in history that an official church investigation concluded that levitation was real and miraculous, while simultaneously acknowledging that such miracles could be problematic for social stability. The church was effectively saying that Joseph's abilities were genuine supernatural phenomena, but too extraordinary for ordinary public life. Even in isolation, Joseph continued to levitate. The friars at the monasteries where he lived reported regular episodes, though these were now witnessed by smaller groups and documented less formally. Some of the most detailed accounts from this period come from Father Rossi, who served as Joseph's confessor during his final years. Father Rossi's private journal, discovered centuries later, contains dozens of descriptions of Joseph's levitations, including precise measurements of how high he floated and how long each episode lasted. According to Father Rossi's journal, Joseph's abilities seemed to intensify as he aged. The levitations became more frequent and more dramatic, sometimes lasting for over an hour. There are accounts of him floating to the tops of trees in the monastery garden, remaining suspended among the branches while apparently in prayer. Other entries describe him levitating during the celebration of private masses, floating behind the altar while continuing to perform the liturgy. One of the most extraordinary accounts from this period involves a levitation that occurred during a thunderstorm. According to Father Rossi, Joseph was praying in the chapel when lightning began flashing outside. Instead of seeking shelter, Joseph suddenly rose into the air and floated toward an open window. To the horror of the other friars present, he floated outside into the storm, remaining suspended in the rain and lightning for nearly 20 minutes before returning to the chapel completely dry. Modern attempts to explain Joseph's levitations have ranged from psychological to paranormal theories. Some researchers have suggested that he might have suffered from a form of temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological condition that can cause intense religious experiences and altered states of consciousness. However, this theory fails to account for the physical levitation witnessed by so many independent observers. Others have proposed that Joseph might have been an early example of psychokinesis, the theoretical ability to move objects using mental energy alone. This explanation suggests that his intense religious devotion might have somehow activated latent psychic abilities, allowing him to overcome gravity through sheer force of will. While this theory is more consistent with the witness accounts, it requires accepting the existence of psychic phenomena that remain scientifically unproven. A more controversial explanation involves the possibility of time distortion or altered states of reality. Some researchers have suggested that Joseph's levitations might represent moments when the normal laws of physics were temporarily suspended, either through divine intervention or through access to altered dimensional states. This theory, while scientifically speculative, would account for both the physical impossibility of the levitations and the consistent witness testimony. What makes Joseph's story particularly compelling to modern researchers is the quality and quantity of the historical documentation. Unlike many religious miracles, which rely on oral tradition or single witness accounts, Joseph's levitations were recorded by multiple independent sources using the documentary standards of the time. Church officials, government representatives, and private individuals all left written records of what they witnessed. The Vatican Secret Archives contain more than 100 official documents related to Joseph's case, including witness testimonies, investigation reports, and correspondence between church officials. These documents provide a level of historical verification that is rare for claims of supernatural phenomena. Even skeptical historians generally acknowledge that something extraordinary occurred, even if they disagree about the explanation. Modern scientific analysis of these historical documents has revealed some interesting patterns. The descriptions of Joseph's levitations are remarkably consistent across different witnesses and time periods, suggesting either a consistent hoax maintained across decades or genuine phenomena that followed predictable patterns. The medical details included in some accounts, such as descriptions of Joseph's physical appearance during levitation, are consistent with what modern medicine would expect during states of intense religious ecstasy. Perhaps most intriguingly, some researchers have noted that the locations where Joseph's most dramatic levitations occurred seem to share certain geographical characteristics. Many of the sites sit on geological formations rich in quartz crystal, leading some to speculate about possible connections between the Earth's electromagnetic fields and reported paranormal phenomena. Joseph died in 1663 at the age of 60, still under restrictions imposed by the Inquisition. His final levitation was reported by the friars attending his deathbed, who claimed that his body rose slightly from the bed just moments before he passed away. He was canonized as a saint in 1767, making him one of the few people in history to achieve sainthood based primarily on supernatural abilities rather than conventional religious virtues. Today, Saint Joseph of Cupertino is the patron saint of aviators, astronauts, and students taking examinations. His shrine in Italy continues to attract visitors from around the world, many of whom come seeking their own miraculous experiences. While modern reports of levitation at the shrine are less dramatic than the historical accounts, some visitors claim to experience unexplained sensations of weightlessness or spiritual transcendence. The question of whether human levitation is possible remains one of the most intriguing mysteries in the intersection of science and spirituality. Joseph's case provides what may be the most thoroughly documented example of such phenomena in recorded history. Whether one believes his levitations were genuine miracles, unknown natural phenomena, or elaborate deceptions, his story challenges our understanding of what might be possible at the outer edges of human experience. The legacy of Saint Joseph of Cupertino extends beyond questions of supernatural abilities. His story represents humanity's ongoing fascination with transcendence, with the possibility that consciousness might not be entirely bound by physical limitations. In an age of increasing scientific understanding, Joseph's levitations remind us that there may still be aspects of reality that exist beyond our current comprehension. As we continue to explore the mysteries of consciousness, quantum physics, and the nature of reality itself, perhaps we'll eventually understand phenomena like Joseph's levitations. Until then, his story remains one of history's most compelling mysteries, a documented case of the impossible that continues to challenge everything we think we know about the limits of human potential. In the mist-shrouded mountains of northern Greece, where ancient monasteries cling to clifftops like stone prayers frozen in time, there exists a mystery that has confounded visitors, pilgrims, and researchers for over 1,000 years. Mount Athos, known as the Holy Mountain, is home to one of Christianity's oldest monastic communities. But according to countless testimonies spanning centuries, some of the monks who call this sacred place home possess an ability that defies all known laws of physics: the power to instantaneously transport themselves across vast distances, appearing and disappearing as if they can fold space and time to their will. These aren't stories relegated to medieval folklore or dismissed as religious fantasy. The accounts of teleporting monks come from credible witnesses including diplomats, scholars, fellow clergy, and even skeptical observers who arrived at Mount Athos specifically to investigate these claims. What they found was a phenomena so consistent, so well documented, and so utterly impossible by conventional understanding that it continues to puzzle researchers today. Mount Athos itself is unlike anywhere else on Earth. This autonomous region of Greece has maintained its independence for over a millennium, governed entirely by Eastern Orthodox monks according to ancient Byzantine law. No women are permitted to enter, a restriction that extends even to female animals, creating what the monks believe is a pure spiritual environment dedicated entirely to prayer and contemplation. The peninsula is home to 20 major monasteries, numerous smaller communities, and hermitages where individual monks pursue lives of extreme asceticism. It's within this environment of intense spiritual discipline that the teleportation phenomena have been most commonly reported. The monks of Mount Athos follow rigorous daily schedules that begin before dawn and include hours of prayer, meditation, and physical labor. Many fast extensively, eating only bread and water for days at a time. Some retreat to caves or isolated cells for months or even years of solitary contemplation. According to numerous accounts, it's often the most dedicated and spiritually advanced monks who demonstrate these impossible abilities. The earliest recorded account of monk teleportation at Mount Athos dates back to the 10th century, found in the chronicles of the monastery of Great Lavra. The document describes a monk named Athanasios who was seen praying in the monastery chapel at evening vespers, but was simultaneously witnessed by other monks gathering firewood several miles away on the mountain slopes. When confronted about this impossibility, Athanasios reportedly smiled and said only that God's love knows no boundaries of space or time. But it's the more recent accounts, documented with the precision of modern record keeping, that provide the most compelling evidence. In 1893, a Russian diplomat named Count Alexei Tolstoy visited Mount Athos as part of a cultural exchange mission. Tolstoy, a cousin of the famous author Leo Tolstoy, was known for his skeptical approach to religious claims and his methodical documentation of everything he observed during his travels. In his detailed travel journal, later published in St. Petersburg, Count Tolstoy described an incident that shook his rationalist worldview to its core. He had been staying at the monastery of Vatopti, interviewing monks about their daily lives and spiritual practices. On his third day there, he was invited to observe the evening prayer service in the monastery's main church. During the service, Tolstoy noticed an elderly monk named Father Seraphim standing near the altar, participating in the liturgical responses. The Count specifically remembered the monk's distinctive appearance, a long white beard, piercing blue eyes, and a pronounced limp that caused him to lean heavily on a wooden staff. Tolstoy noted these details because he had interviewed Father Seraphim earlier that day about monastic traditions. Halfway through the service, Count Tolstoy stepped outside the church for fresh air, as the incense and crowded conditions were making him feel faint. To his amazement, he saw the same elderly monk, Father Seraphim, sitting peacefully in the monastery garden, apparently in deep meditation. The distance from the church to the garden was several hundred meters, and there was no possible way for the monk to have left the service and reached the garden without passing directly by Tolstoy. Confused and thinking he might have been mistaken about the monk's identity, Tolstoy returned to the church. Father Seraphim was there, in the same position as before, still participating in the prayers as if he had never left. After the service, Tolstoy immediately approached the monk and asked him directly about what had happened. According to the Count's journal, Father Seraphim looked at him with gentle amusement and replied, "My son, when the soul is truly at peace, the body need not always follow the same paths as other men." This cryptic response only deepened Tolstoy's confusion, but it established a pattern that appears in many accounts of monk teleportation. The phenomena seem to be connected to deep states of spiritual contemplation or prayer. The monks themselves rarely discuss their abilities directly, often responding to questions with mystical references or religious parables that neither confirm nor deny what witnesses have observed. A more dramatic account comes from 1927, when a team of Greek archaeologists was conducting excavations near the monastery of Simonoptra. The team was led by Dr. Dimitrios Evangelides, a respected academic from the University of Athens who maintained detailed field notes of everything that occurred during the expedition. According to Dr. Evangelides' records, the archaeological team had been working for several weeks when they encountered a dangerous situation. A section of cliff face had become unstable due to their excavations, and several team members were trapped on a narrow ledge with no apparent way to reach safety. The collapse had occurred suddenly, cutting off their escape route and leaving them stranded dozens of meters above the valley floor. Word of the emergency reached the nearby monastery, and several monks came to assist with the rescue effort. Among them was a monk identified in the records as Father Nectarios, who was known for his skill in mountain climbing and his knowledge of the treacherous terrain around the monastery. However, when Father Nectarios assessed the situation, even he declared it impossible to reach the trapped archaeologists safely with conventional climbing methods. What happened next was witnessed not only by Dr. Evangelides, but by his entire team of 8 researchers, as well as several local villagers who had gathered to help with the rescue. According to their unanimous testimony, Father Nectarios knelt in prayer for several minutes, then simply vanished from where he stood. A moment later, he appeared on the ledge beside the trapped archaeologists, somehow having crossed dozens of meters of empty space instantaneously. The rescue proceeded normally from that point, with Father Nectarios using ropes and traditional climbing techniques to help the archaeologists reach safety one by one. But when Dr. Evangelides later tried to question the monk about how he had reached the ledge, Father Nectarios merely smiled and suggested that divine providence finds a way to help those in need. Dr. Evangelides was so disturbed by what he had witnessed that he spent the remaining weeks of his expedition interviewing other monks and local residents about similar incidents. His field notes record dozens of stories, some dating back generations, of monks appearing and disappearing in ways that seemed to violate basic physical laws. He also discovered that the phenomena was not limited to emergency situations, but occurred regularly during the monks' daily spiritual practices. One of the most intriguing patterns Dr. Evangelides identified was the connection between teleportation events and specific times of day. According to his interviews, the majority of reported incidents occurred during traditional prayer hours: dawn, noon, sunset, and midnight. This suggested to him that the phenomena might be connected to the heightened spiritual states that monks achieved during intensive prayer and meditation. The archaeologist also noted geographical patterns in the reports. Certain locations on Mount Athos seemed to be more conducive to teleportation events than others. These included ancient chapels, natural caves that had been used for meditation, and specific mountain peaks where hermit monks had lived in isolation for years. Dr. Evangelides theorized that these locations might have some kind of unique energy or spiritual significance that facilitated the impossible transportations. Perhaps the most scientifically rigorous investigation of Mount Athos teleportation phenomena was conducted in 1956 by Dr. Maria Constantinou, a physicist from the Technical University of Athens. Dr. Constantinou had initially planned to study the acoustic properties of the monastery churches for her research on architectural acoustics. However, during her 3-month stay on the Holy Mountain, she became fascinated by the persistent reports of monk teleportation. Unlike previous investigators who had relied primarily on witness testimony, Dr. Constantinou attempted to approach the phenomena using scientific methodology. With the permission of the monastic authorities, she set up a series of observation points around several monasteries, equipped with cameras and timing devices that were advanced for their era. Her goal was to document any instances of anomalous movement or disappearance that might be captured objectively. The results of her study, published in a limited edition academic journal in 1958, were both fascinating and frustrating. Dr. Constantinou recorded 17 separate incidents over 3 months where monks appeared to move between distant locations faster than would be physically possible. However, the limitations of 1950s technology meant that her photographic evidence was often inconclusive, showing blurred figures or empty spaces where witnesses insisted they had seen monks moments before. What made Dr. Constantinou's study particularly valuable was her detailed analysis of the environmental conditions during reported teleportation events. She noted that the majority of incidents occurred during specific weather patterns: clear, dry days with minimal wind and particular atmospheric pressure readings. She also documented unusual electromagnetic readings in the areas where teleportations were reported, though she lacked the equipment to determine whether these anomalies were connected to the phenomena or merely coincidental. Dr. Constantinou's most significant observation was her documentation of what she termed displacement events. These were incidents where monks appeared to be in 2 places simultaneously, similar to what Count Tost had reported decades earlier. Using synchronized timing devices, she was able to confirm that these weren't cases of mistaken identity or optical illusions, but genuine instances where the same individual seemed to exist in multiple locations at once. The physicist's attempts to interview the monks directly about their experiences yielded little concrete information. Like previous investigators, she found that the monks were reluctant to discuss their abilities in scientific terms. They spoke instead of prayer, divine grace, and the transcendence of earthly limitations through spiritual discipline. While these responses were unsatisfying from a scientific perspective, they did provide insight into how the monks themselves understood their extraordinary abilities. One of the most detailed accounts in Dr. Constantinu's records involved a monk named Father Pacios, who would later be canonized as a saint by the Eastern Orthodox Church. According to her notes, Father Pacios was known throughout Mount Athos for his extreme asceticism and his alleged ability to appear in multiple monasteries simultaneously during times of crisis or need. Dr. Constantinu spent considerable time trying to document Father Pacios' activities, but found it nearly impossible to predict when teleportation events might occur. The phenomena seemed to be spontaneous, connected to the monk's spiritual state, rather than any external factors she could measure or control. However, she did manage to record one incident that provided valuable scientific data. On a clear September morning in 1956, Dr. Constantinu was conducting acoustic measurements in the chapel of the Philithiou Monastery when Father Pacios entered for morning prayers. She noted his arrival time as 6:15 a.m. and observed him throughout the service, which lasted approximately 45 minutes. Her equipment recorded his voice during the liturgical responses, providing audio documentation of his presence. However, at 6:40 a.m., Dr. Constantinu received an urgent message from her assistant, who was stationed at the Great Lavra Monastery 5 kilometers away. The message stated that Father Pacios was there, helping to care for a seriously ill monk who had taken a turn for the worse during the night. The assistant provided specific details about the monk's appearance and behavior that matched Dr. Constantinu's observations perfectly. Most remarkably, when Dr. Constantinu checked with the Great Lavra Monastery after the morning service concluded, she confirmed that Father Pacios had indeed been there during the exact time period when she had observed him at Philithiou. The timing was verified by multiple witnesses at both locations, and the distance between the monasteries made conventional travel impossible within the time frame involved. This incident became the centerpiece of Dr. Constantinu's research, as it provided the most objective documentation of simultaneous bilocation that she was able to achieve. Her analysis of the acoustic data revealed something even more puzzling. The voice recordings from both locations showed identical vocal characteristics and speech patterns, suggesting that it was indeed the same person speaking in both places at once. Modern attempts to explain the Mount Athos teleportation phenomena have drawn on various theories from quantum physics, consciousness research, and parapsychology. Some researchers have suggested that the monk's extreme meditation practices might enable them to access quantum states of reality, where the normal rules of space and time don't apply. This theory proposes that consciousness itself might have properties that allow it to transcend physical limitations under certain conditions. Another explanation involves the concept of morphic fields, proposed by biologist Rupert Sheldrake. According to this theory, intense spiritual practices might create energetic connections between individuals and locations that allow for instantaneous information transfer, or even physical transportation. The 1,000-year history of intense prayer and meditation at Mount Athos might have created a unique morphic field that facilitates these extraordinary phenomena. Skeptical researchers have proposed more conventional explanations, including misidentification, optical illusions, and coordinated deception. They argue that the isolated environment of Mount Athos, combined with the power of religious suggestion, might create conditions where witnesses perceive supernatural events that have natural explanations. However, these theories struggle to account for the consistency of reports across centuries and the quality of evidence provided by trained observers like Dr. Constantinu. Perhaps the most intriguing modern development in Mount Athos research involves advances in quantum physics and our understanding of non-locality. Recent experiments in quantum mechanics have demonstrated that particles can indeed exist in multiple states simultaneously, and that information can be transmitted instantaneously across vast distances. While these phenomena occur at the subatomic level, Some physicists have speculated that similar effects might be possible on larger scales under specific conditions. The meditation practices of Mount Athos monks involve techniques that have been refined over centuries to induce profound altered states of consciousness. These states are characterized by dissolution of the normal sense of self, transcendence of ordinary time perception, and experiences of unity with the divine. Some researchers theorize that these intense altered states might occasionally trigger quantum effects at the macroscopic level, allowing for the teleportation phenomena that have been so consistently reported. Current scientific understanding suggests that human teleportation should be impossible due to the enormous energy requirements and the complex quantum information that would need to be transmitted. However, the persistent reports from Mount Athos, documented by credible witnesses over many centuries, suggest that our understanding of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality may be incomplete. The monks themselves offer a different perspective on these phenomena. According to their theological understanding, the physical world is not the ultimate reality, but rather a reflection of deeper spiritual truths. From this perspective, apparent violations of physical laws are not impossible events, but natural expressions of spiritual reality breaking through into the material world. Father Ephraim, the current abbot of Philitheu Monastery, has written that the teleportation abilities demonstrated by some monks are not supernatural powers in the sense that most people understand them. Instead, he describes them as natural consequences of achieving deep union with divine consciousness. According to his explanation, when a monk transcends his individual ego through prayer and asceticism, he becomes capable of participating in God's omnipresence, which exists beyond the limitations of space and time. This theological interpretation suggests that the teleportation phenomena are not violations of natural law, but rather demonstrations of natural laws that operate at levels of reality beyond our current scientific understanding. From this perspective, the monks are not breaking the rules of physics, but accessing deeper principles that govern the relationship between consciousness and physical existence. Recent technological advances have opened new possibilities for investigating the Mount Athos phenomena. Modern monitoring equipment could potentially provide much more detailed documentation than was possible during Dr. Constantinu's 1950s study. However, the monastic authorities have become increasingly protective of their privacy and are generally reluctant to allow extensive scientific investigation of their spiritual practices. A few researchers who have been granted access in recent decades report that teleportation events continue to occur, though they seem to be less frequent than in previous eras. Some monks suggest that this decline is related to the increasing intrusion of modern technology and secular influences into their traditionally isolated community. Others believe that the phenomena require such intense spiritual preparation that fewer modern monks are able to achieve the necessary level of transcendence. What remains constant is the profound impact that these experiences have on those who witness them. Whether one interprets the Mount Athos teleportation phenomena as genuine supernatural events, unknown natural phenomena, or elaborate illusions, they continue to challenge our understanding of consciousness, reality, and human potential. The mystery of the teleporting monks represents something larger than just unexplained phenomena. It touches on fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between mind and matter, and the possibility that human beings might possess capabilities far beyond what conventional science currently recognizes. As our understanding of quantum mechanics, consciousness, and the nature of reality continues to evolve, perhaps we'll eventually develop frameworks that can accommodate the extraordinary accounts from Mount Athos. Until then, the teleporting monks remain one of history's most persistent and intriguing mysteries, a reminder that the boundaries of human experience may extend far beyond what we currently imagine possible. The Holy Mountain continues to maintain its ancient traditions, and the monks continue their practices of intensive prayer and meditation that have been unchanged for over a millennium. Whether they still possess the ability to transcend the normal limitations of space and time remains an open question, one that may only be answered by those with the dedication and spiritual preparation to walk the same path of transcendence that has been followed on Mount Athos for more than 1,000 years. The past is filled with mysteries, some guarded behind locked doors, some hidden in ancient texts, and others etched into stone for centuries, waiting to be understood. The stories we've uncovered tonight are only a glimpse into the strange, the unexplained, and the guarded secrets of the Vatican that continue to baffle scholars and ignite endless debate. But as with all great mysteries, the more we uncover, the more questions emerge.